Hi, everybody. How's it going? I guess I'll look into the camera today. So we got a very special stream for you. As always, I'm joined by Leandro Facchinetti, and I'll let him say hi in a second. But we also have a special guest, Justin, and you may not know his name or face, but you are very likely to be familiar with his work. He is the author of ReEQ, not to be confused with ReEQ.
ReEQ, yeah.
Yeah. And ReSpectrum, which, as it happens, they dropped exactly 3 years ago today on the ReaFIR forums, and they've since kind of become the go-to EQ and spectrum analyzer for a lot of ReaFIR users because they're really wonderful. Well, first of all, they're fully resizable EQs with a very beautiful GUI. That to me just kind of reminds me of like Fabfilter's Pro Q3. And you have, I think, 16 bands or maybe 24 bands and tons of other really awesome features. So hi, Justin. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
Mm-hmm. Did I get that right? It's 16 bands, right? And then you can automate the first 5.
I think it might be 12, actually.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. And hi, Leandro. How you doing?
Hello, Arya. Thanks for inviting me for this conversation. I was looking forward to this the whole week since Justin said yes last week. It's such a pleasure to be here and to finally meet you, Justin. I completely look up to your work. It is truly an inspiration for the kinds of JSFX that I want to build, and especially not just because the interface looks good, but also because it's functional. Everything serves a purpose and it just works so well and it sounds great. You implemented the same filters that have been implemented by all the great EQs out there. So it's just lovely to meet you and to be in this conversation.
Yeah, likewise.
We also got a lot of people in the chats, which is unusual for our kind of very small niche of people wanting to code for JSFX, who also happen to be somewhat beginners like myself. So it's nice to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people in the chat and another 6 just lurking. Thanks for being here. Lots of love for your EQ going on here, Justin.
Great.
So you're in the forums. You go by nitsuj, which
That's right.
I'm. That's just the reverse of your own name.
Crack the code.
Yeah. And what have you been up to kind of recently and since ReEQ? I know you've done like lots of patching with ReEQ, but what have you been working on lately in the world of DSP, stuff like that?
Okay, generally in DSP, well, first I can say that writing DSP and being involved in all of that isn't it's not my day job, as it were. My day job for I run a company that is completely different, deals with medical digital health software, that sort of thing. So the DSP thing is really I'd say it's a hobby, but but like a lot of hobbies, it becomes a bit of an obsessive sort of hobby. It's such a fascinating rich area of sort of technology to be involved with. So at the moment, time permitting, times we've got to put sort of bread on the table, but time permitting, when I get a chance to work on ReEQ, I've got a few different branches in GitHub. Some sort of it's about sort of trying to work out a dynamic EQ for it. So there's some initial sort of promising tests on that.
Wow.
There's an overhaul of the AGC, the automatic gain control. I've had a few little issues with that, but it's a complete revamping of that. But again, there's quite a few experimental things, and at some point they will kind of burst through and make it into a release and get published. The other thing that I'm just sort of generally working on, which is a very sort of long-term project, is a very sort of industrial strength sort of wavetable synthesizer that takes its inspiration from the sort of Waldorfs and the Iridiums and Quantums and so on. So that's That's equally sort of fascinating as well. So, but you know, that's in the interesting thing is I'm having to go to C++ to do that for performance reasons. But a lot of the prototype for the oscillators and the filters and that kind of thing is all done in ReaFIR, because it's such a wonderful testbed environment to be testing those things out.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, so your company is BiotaWare, right?
Yep, that's right. Yep.
Yeah, that's cool. What I find kind of interesting is that, like, when I was reading, I'm just kind of reading this book on DSP, and like, well, a lot of like digital signals aren't necessarily audio. They could be like related to medical equipment and stuff. So do you use DSP but not for audio, but like you do something like that with your medical devices as well? Is there an overlap there?
Well, there's certainly an element of signal processing and visualization, because you know we take a lot of data from Fitbits and process that, and from other sort of biosensors and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's definitely. I've never really thought about it too much like that, but it's definitely sort of signal related. It's the similar sort of thing, and again, sort of visualizing those signals and making sense of them. But the great thing about audio DSP is that you actually get to hear them. You actually get to hear those signals and hope that they actually sound good when you do hear them, meaning that you've got the algorithms right.
Wow, that's so cool. So yeah, I know, Leandro, you have some questions, so let me just pass it off to you, because I know you are you would be the expert more than me. You'd be on a similar level to Justin. Yeah. So
kind of far from it, but actually the thing that I'm most curious about is, what are the walls you hit when using JSFX that made you go to C++? And you mentioned performance, but what kinds of things were you trying to do and performance became an issue? Or maybe you were just using C++ because you wanted to target other hosts besides ReaFIR. So what's the story there?
Yeah, well, there is the idea about the other hosts, and that you can sort of compile down to, using Juice, you compile down to VST, AU, and all the rest of it. But it's still the case generally, if you want to go for maximum performance, you've got to go to something like C++, just because there's literally decades and decades of optimizing compiler technology, and that'll really get the performance that you need. JSFX is great, and certainly with ReEQ, it exceeded my expectation. But there are some limits you can achieve for it. For example, if ReEQ was cranked up to, say, a 32 node, sort of filter system, then, and you had all 32 filter nodes, doing some fairly heavy filtering, then you'd need a really good machine to run that. And so for a synthesizer, a full-blown synthesizer, where you're, maybe got 32 voice polyphony, each voice has got, about 4 or 5 different sort of analog model filters working on it. It's doing all the sort of wave morphing that I'm sort of trying to achieve at the moment. That really, really builds up, and you've got to start, even in C++, you have to start digging deep to try and get the performance out of it. But nevertheless, but in JSFX, again, it gives you a really fast, rapid testbed for working out the DSP, because the problem with C++ is that you could say that JSFX gives you a bit of rope to hang yourself, but C++ gives you the whole rope factory to hang yourself with. It's much, much harder, and I've got decades of experience in C++. It's still a difficult language to deal with.
So I hear, I have no experience with C++ myself, but I hear that there are all sorts of ways to break things. Less so in the last few standards. I think that C++ 11 is better than it was before, but still, I have very little experience with this, so I couldn't tell.
Yeah, it's much better. I came back to C++ from a bit of a hiatus from it, and it had moved on considerably, especially if you use all the modern sort of templating standards and STD stuff and so on. But for a lot of things, you still need to be quite aware of what's going off underneath the hood and what all these template sort of things are actually compiling down to, and how it's getting, down to the actual sort of machine code that the compiler produces. That needs to be as fast as possible. And then when you blend into that SSE and all of the, SIMD things you've got to do as well to squeeze even more performance out of it, it's pretty hardcore.
Is this synthesizer that you're working on going to be open source?
I don't know yet. That's a really good question. It might be. I don't know. I think I'm a good year or two away from, where I want to be with it. So I've got plenty of time to decide.
I see. Yeah, I mean, I say that selfishly because I learned so much from reading your code, and I want to read more of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, somebody in the chat is asking, Justin, if you can discuss any pros and cons of C# versus C++.
Yeah. I mean, C#'s great. I mean, it's likewise with Java. So those languages generally, well, it depends which C#. I mean, those languages generally used to rely on really, really advanced just-in-time compilation. But I think with C# now, I think that's still a case. You can, if you're talking about like the C# engine that you may be getting Unity or something like that, then I mean, full commercial games have been made with that. And I think I watched a video some time ago about an audio engine that was being introduced for, a DSP, like a graph-based, node-based audio system, which I took some inspiration from in some of the coding that I've been doing in C++, the architecture. So, but again, you've got to have your wits about you for low-level stuff to make sure that there's no unnecessary sort of code being generated by the just-in-time system or so on, which is going to slow things down. So you've still got to, so you can do it, but I guess unless you can get it compiled into a VST or an AU or something like that, and I'm not sure there is anything like that for C#, then I don't know what the plugin options are for writing plugins with it. But it's a great language. It's a great language.
And also, as far as I understand, C# is garbage collected the same way that Java is. And if it behaves in the same way that Java behaves, I don't think it's a good thing for real-time audio processing, because the garbage collector is going to be like, okay, hang in there for 200 milliseconds, and then you just dropped a lot of samples.
Yeah, so like a garbage collected language, you're right. A garbage collected language is like the worst thing that could happen in an audio application, really. So I mean, one of the things you learn about in any audio application is that over on the C++ side, for example, is that on the audio thread where all the audio is being processed, you really can't use any system calls. You can't use any kind of memory allocation. So you have to adopt strategies where everything's kind of allocated up front. All the buffers are allocated, everything's set up, and there are absolutely no new or deletes or memory allocations or deallocations at all on the audio thread, and no system calls, because you can't trust them. You don't know if they're going to mutex on other threads, or they're going to wait for things, or they're going to wait for a hard disk drive to finish, and all of that will just kill audio outright. So I suppose you'd have to adopt, in a garbage collected language, you'd have to adopt the same strategy, and that is you'd have to allocate everything up front, and then on an audio thread just make sure that there was no allocation going off, and that no garbage collection could really sort of wreck it, as it were, on the audio thread. Yeah.
And what is it about JSFX that makes it good for prototyping?
Well, it's so simple. It's so easy. And, in fact, I mean, sometimes that simplicity can kind of make it difficult later when something starts to get quite complex. I found this with ReEQ. But it's kind of a few steps up from Assembler. It's kind of a sandboxed sort of thing. So it's got its just memory laid out as a bunch of doubles essentially, and there is no new, there is no allocation and deallocation. You've got to kind of do that yourself just by index ring fencing chunks of memory. It's a really simple kind of sandbox sort of system. The actual language itself is really sort of straightforward and easy to learn. It's a little bit odd to start with, if you come from a language like C++, but that's just to do with, whether you're using braces or round brackets or just a few sort of syntactic sort of details. And then, there's learning that it's purely a functional thing. So the last thing in a function is going to be the thing that returns from the function. But I think it's its simplicity. I think that's its real strength. And of course, if you've got something really simple, then you can, you've got the code in the bag. You're not going to blow the machine up. You're not going to crash the whole thing using JSFX. You'll get weird results is the worst thing you'll get. You won't actually take down the program or the DAW session. And that's it. And the documentation as well on the ReaPIR side, the documentation for it's really straightforward, just super simple. And it's just perfect for prototyping actually.
Yeah, one thing that I like about JSFX is that you can reload the effect in real time when you are developing it, and all the variables are going to keep around. Yeah. And the right pane showing essentially a debugger kind of thing, showing you all the values is super handy as well. And as far as I can tell, there is something like that in Juice, but not quite. And I haven't ever actually played with it. I played with just compiling the code and loading the VST in ReaPIR. So you do that kind of interactive coding in C++? Does it work well?
Yeah, sure. So, well, just to recap, you're right. You've got this sort of hot loading, because it's so JSFX is like a really tight little script language, and they've allowed you to sort of just hot load it in, and you can see the variables like you say. So it's perfect for that. Over on the Juice side or C++ side, you can set it up so that when you run your session from Xcode. I use Xcode because I'm on Mac. You can actually set it up so you can debug it. So I have ReaPIR. So essentially, when I run my plugin from Xcode, it fires ReaPIR up. I've got a session with the plugin already there. It runs the plugin, but it's kind of the Xcode system knows about it. So you can put breakpoints in. You can look at all the variables. You can actually debug it while it's running inside ReaPIR, which is like really, really useful.
Yeah, really I think cool. That's essential to get anything complicated right.
Yeah, you'd be. You could do it, but it's hard work. You're back to doing some sort of debug print sort of things, or implementing your own console window to throw variables into, that sort of thing. But no, it's a real boon.
That's cool. I always wonder, whenever we've had guests on here, like kind of what attracted you to first kind of like just making your own plugins or synths, and then also what attracted you to JSFX, or like how did you find out about it? What was your kind of early days of messing around? What were they like?
Yeah, so the way that I came to it, well, certainly. I mean, many moons ago, I worked in the sort of games industry. I was a sort of 3D engine sort of programmer, and I worked on a lot of console devices at really sort of low level. So I was always interested in sort of low level kind of sort of techie sort of stuff. Anyway, that kind of runs through me. Now, in terms of coming way back, it was really serendipity. So years and years ago as well. Oh God, 20 odd years ago, I did have a load of synths, and I used to love pottering about with those, a real sort of in a sort of fanatical way. And a few years ago, I sort of came back to it and think, you know what, I've got a bit more time on my hands now. It'd be good to really get back into it. So I started getting back into the music side of things. But the more I got into it, and the more synthesizers I bought, and I had to look at them and started playing around, the engineer in me was like, how's that working? What are they doing under? I just wanted to take it to pieces and see how it was all working, and lo and behold, you've got things like spectrum analyzers, span, and all sorts of things that you can sort of start looking at the visual output of these plugins and synthesizers and compressors and all the rest of this sort of stuff. And it was just burning curiosity to think, all right, how they're doing that. So low-level games programming, that sort of thing. I mean, it's kind of ballpark similar to audio DSP work. You're under real-time performance constraints. It's kind of low-level. You've got to watch what you're doing. You've got to put certain hard rules in place to make it all work. And I was kind of blown away as I was reading more about ReaPIR. I mean, ReaPIR was the first tool that I got. I mean, I've got a whole bunch of them now, and I need to sort of test things in with them. But it's the first one, and it's the one that I always come to for speed and using and prototyping and that sort of thing. And I was just amazed to see that JSFX existed. You know, it was just a spectacular thing. I mean, I suppose Ableton's got its Max for Live, but that's kind of a graph DSP thing that's kind of hooked in. Whereas JSFX really speaks to, you know, DIY programming and that sort of thing, hands-on, typing the code, tweaking it, seeing if it works. And also the biggest boom with JSFX as well is the huge volume of, you know, source code snippets out there and utilities and things that other people have written. And the forum as well. The forum's incredible, you know. It's an absolute gold mine for anybody that wants to do DSP, you know. And I just really feel sorry for people that have come into DSP and don't know about it, don't know about ReaPIR and JSFX, because it's such an incredible asset, you know. Yeah. So there. So and you know, and I suppose moving on from that, once I saw code on the screen as a JFX, I was kind of like, right. Okay, this code, what's it doing, you know? And then of course you get the code, you start messing about with it, changing it. What does this do? Why didn't that work? And before you know, you're just down a whole bunch of rabbit holes. You know, but it's just wonderfully fascinating and interesting. Yeah, and I suppose a while of doing that slowly got me down the rabbit hole of you know, starting to write ReEQ really. In ReSpectrum.
And then I guess the big question also is GUI. Tell us some, or Leandro, maybe you have some specific questions about GUI.
Oh, I have a couple, because one of the things that I want to do with my JSFX is to make them visual. I trust my eyes. I trust my ears, but I trust my eyes as well. And I want the effects that the thing is having on the audio to be seen, and ReEQ is perfect for that. I mean, it shows you all the EQ curves. It's just beautiful and functional. So I have many questions, high level and low level, but I'm going to start with the high level, which is, what are the tricks of the trade that you learned? Because GFX are so bare bones. You can draw a line, you can draw a circle, and you can draw arcs, but that is pretty much it. Everything else you had to do by hand. The curves you had to do by hand, and highlighting some of the areas underneath the curve you had to do by hand. So what are the tricks that you learned in the process, things that worked and didn't work?
Right. So I think the main thing is that, you know, the whole sort of JSFX system really only comes with, as you highlighted, it's got some really just rudimentary sort of, you know, drawing tools, you know, sort of lines, arcs, you can fill things in, polygons, there's things like that, but it's fairly, I don't want to say basic, but it's fairly, you know, it's fairly low level and simple and straightforward. So the thing for me, what had got to a point where I was like, well, I went through a lot of iterations. So take, for example, the bands that are drawn, the filter bands that are drawn in ReEQ. To start with, they were just lines. So at the very beginning, I suppose it's worth mentioning this, is my aspiration very early on was to see if I could do a really simple 3 or 4 band EQ that was kind of a bit like Ableton's EQ8. Similar thing, so nothing fancy, just lines for the filter bands, a bit like ReEQ's got. But having done that, I thought, you know, again, I thought, right, okay, can we colour those in? So I was looking around, and obviously, you know, it's worth mentioning Fabfilter's, you know, Pro Q3, but I also, you know, was looking at EQs like Equilibrium, DMG Audio's Equilibrium, which is phenomenal. And I thought, well, we've got the commands to draw the things, but the question then was, is it going to be fast enough? Because that's a lot of, all of the bands underneath ReEQ, they're essentially just lines and lines of quads that are being drawn on a gradient. So I didn't know if it was going to be fast enough. I didn't know if it could do it, because a lot of the other JSFXs that I'd seen were fairly rudimentary in terms of the graphics that we're pushing. So it was just experimental. So I did that, and it held up. And I added more bands, and it kind of still held up. And it just worked out. And then the rest of it really is about an aesthetic, about choosing nice colors for it, about, I mean, there's other things as well. So the actual lines that are drawn, so you see the white line there is actually the sort of filter response curve, and the colored ones are actually representing the individual filter bands. Well, line drawing is not straightforward, because by default ReaFIR only draws lines with a set sort of limited kind of thickness, sort of 1 pixel thickness. So I had to figure out and come up with some fairly hacky scheme of drawing multiple lines to sort of thicken the lines out, because they're far too thin. So I go between sort of two monitors. I've got a lower res Dell monitor, and then I've got my Mac, you know, sort of Retina sort of thing. And again, there's code in there which will choose what kind of thickness of line to try and hack together, as it were, depending on what kind of display you've got. So that was, and again, it's a little bit hacky. I mean, it would have been much nicer if, you know, the ReaFIR devs had given a proper sort of path thing for lines with multiple thicknesses, and a bit like you get in libraries like nitsuj, VG, or other sort of libraries. But you know, you have to make do.
I'm laughing because I actually ran into this issue of a line being too thin. I was streaming and I was coding, and people couldn't really see the line on the stream because it was so thin. And I came up with the solution, which I guess is similar to yours. I didn't actually read the source code for this part, but what I'm doing is just drawing a bunch of lines. So I guess we can sort of see that here. We can see the aliasing on the line, because you're drawing one line and then one line 1 pixel below, and then another line 1 pixel below that to make it thicker.
That's it, trying to thicken it out. Yeah, trying to thicken the source up. Yep. But you know, and again, my worry was all the time, oh, you know, this is quite a lot of drawing that's got to be done for you know, even though JSFX does compile down to machine code, it's still, you know, it's I still was quite worried that it just wouldn't be able to cope with all the drawing that's going off, especially when the spectrum analyzer was thrown in behind it all as well. But no, it seems to hold up pretty well, even on a Retina display.
Yeah, and Bo, who is watching us right now, actually found your forum thread asking for different thicknesses of lines, but I don't think it was answered.
No, well, you know, I mean, you can do but ask, and or hopefully, you know, it comes up on the radar at some point.
And how do you do the little blue highlighting here? Do you have like a polygon that is this shape, or a bunch of polygons?
No, it's just another line.
Oh, so
so
you're just drawing a bunch of lines so 1 pixel apart?
Yeah. Which bit are you talking about? The very edge of the curve?
No, I'm talking about the blue area.
Oh, that. Yeah, sorry. No, that's what I was talking about. That was that's a quad fill, essentially. That's like two triangles.
Okay.
All the way down. So the way that the drawing happens is it sort of goes from left to right on those, and it's getting the filter response curve. There's a few different routines for drawing these things. But as it's drawing, for example, the purple sort of filled in sort of curve thing there, it's doing it in like vertical strips as it goes along from left to right. So it kind of draws them first, then it draws the actual sort of kind of line on top, because that looks nicer, and then last of all it draws the filter response curve, which is the white sort of line you see. Yeah, so there's quite a lot of drawing going off.
There's a question from the comment section as well. Andrew is asking, I'm curious about your thoughts on ReaFIR's embedded JSFX GUI in the mixer. It's the coolest part of Harrison Mixbus, yet ReaFIR can do so much more. Do you think this feature has untapped potential? I think it's for both of you.
Yeah, well, I can answer that. I think it's a great feature. And in fact, as soon as that came out, I set about, altering ReEQ in such a way that it takes advantage of that. So one of the things about ReEQ is that the screen's really resizable in it, and it's got a bit of intelligence in there in terms of, when you resize it, it'll start hiding things. The panel will get hidden at some point if it's too small, and it kind of adjusts itself. What do they call that in web programming? It's like responsive, isn't it? It's like responsive formatting. And one of the things it does as well, if it goes to a certain size, I go on the assumption that it's embedded in that way in TCP, and then it's kind of adjusted, and even the lines are adjusted as well in ReEQ. So it's there. I mean, the nodes really want pulling down, making a bit smaller in there, but it's kind of there. It lives in there. It's okay.
So is that a separate bit of code that you have to write for the embedding, or is it just a matter of your plugin just working kind of in any size, which is one of the things I love the most about it? And same thing with ReSpectrum. Like, I can make it any size. I can make it literally like tiny. Yeah. So that's just part of that for the embedding in the. Okay, cool.
That's it. You've got it. Yeah, because unfortunately, last time I checked, there was no actual, flag in there to say whether it was embedded or not. I mean, that'd be ideal, wouldn't it? If they exposed a flag in JSFX, we could say, am I embedded in the TCP or whatever? In which case you could, but at the moment it just works. It just goes on size.
Cool. Yeah, and I think as for like untapped potential for like embedding, like definitely, because it's a newer feature, and then they're constantly implementing new features. So it's like one pattern I've kind of caught on to with ReaFIR is something comes out and then they leave it, and then 6 months kind of in the future they add a bunch of stuff to it. So I think track wiring, I'm hoping for them to suddenly be like, here's a bunch of new stuff about that. Yeah, they're doing a lot with 2 people, so sometimes it takes a while for them to take like a simple feature that they just added and like really kind of pimp it out, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, the ReaFIR devs, they're just machines. I mean, just over the last, I don't know, month or two, the amount of updates that they've issued out with a whole, you look at the changelog and it's a whole bunch of stuff that they've fixed or improved or made better, or it's just, the rate of development is just relentless. It's quite admirable, really. It's quite impressive.
Somebody else asked if there's a dynamic EQ function for ReEQ coming, and that's coming. Consider yourself teased with that.
Yeah, it's. I got as far as writing some of the DSP for it, and then the trick was how to hook it in to all the band processing that's kind of happening at the moment, without making the general use of ReEQ, slower in some way. Because, a lot of the time you're not going to be using dynamic EQ, and you shouldn't really be penalized performance-wise because it's in there. So that was one of the. It will probably find its way in at some point. Most of the DSP is written for it.
So even checking if you have a dynamic band or not is already expensive enough that it slows everything else down?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. We could probably go at some point to some of the ReEQ source code if it might help. You'd see where it has to get inserted in, but it's which code path you take. There's a lot of very streamlined, hardwired code for going through the various bands, and I take great pains in that to say, right, if this band isn't enabled, then don't do any processing whatsoever, and it's fairly optimal in that way. So you only, performance-wise, you only pay for the bands that are actually processed, and that's fine. With dynamic EQ, it's just kind of going to, from my last sort of workings with it, it's going to kind of really bloat that out, and it's already like, about 3 or 4 pages long. That's the @sample section. So it's just working out how to get it in there without, and providing clean code paths for both dynamic EQ band processing and conventional band processing. So yeah, it's just a bunch of stuff to figure out. I'm sure there's a way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly even doing like a separate, I guess, dynamic EQ. Maybe it has 6 bands, so or people can still use like ReEQ legacy, and then dynamic processing is available to people who need it, kind of thing.
It could be. Yeah, I mean, it's how you'd manage that again. It's another thing to maintain, and if features go into ReEQ, would they then got to duplicate them across? And I'm confident I can get it in ReEQ. Just needs a little bit of effort.
And was it your first time getting into this concept, reading the Andy Simper's papers that ReEQ's filters are based on, and even how to draw the curves? Because doing the DSP is one thing, but showing everything is also a lot of mathematics. It's sometimes even more. And was it your first time getting into all of this, or you already had experience in this area?
No, it was the first time that I'd done anything like that, sort of showing any sort of audio. So it was an interesting thing, actually, because when I first started out, it literally started as a small JSFX with one slider in it for a low pass filter. I mean, that's literally what I started with. And then I added it. Oh, right, okay, we can change the slope of the filter, and maybe we can do some other things. And straight away I was like, okay, well, if I'm gonna maybe I can turn it into just a JSFX with sliders and the sliders can be, maybe a fixed band EQ, as it were. So you got a low pass, a couple of peaks or whatever, shelf, and maybe 5 or 6 fixed sort of filters. And that straight away led me on to, right, okay, well, I need some filter code. And of course, the first thing that anybody comes across when looking at filter code is the Rbj sort of cookbook filters. Tried and tested, that have been used in countless EQs over time. And I just kept digging, and then I came across Andy Simper's paper, which I actually got over the way here now, which is his paper was entitled "Solving the Continuous SVF Equations Using Trapezoidal Integration and Equivalent Currents." So somebody come in, only roughly having a vague idea of what a filter is and getting a mouthful of that, and it was fun reading. And it's a great paper, and Andy's linked it from his Cytomics website. It's very gracious of him to publish it, actually. And the actual paper, if you look at it, it's got I think, is it Octave or MATLAB, something like that, the code in there. And right at the bottom, it's got various graphs and charts about how he was working it out and what the math was in. And then right at the bottom is literally the pseudocode for low pass, band, high, notch, peak, the whole job lot, really.
Bo is asking in the chat if you could talk about differences between Rbj and SVJ filters.
The SVF.
SVF, oh, sorry.
Yes. So, to my knowledge, what it is the Rbj filters can, and again, I my knowledge goes so far on this, but they can become unstable when they're modulated really quickly, really fast. That sort, they can become numerically unstable over time. So if you've got just a fixed EQ, it's fine. They kind of should be okay. But if you start modulating things for, say, example, a dynamic EQ, then you could run into problem with them. They become numerically unstable and can literally sort of blow up. So that's a downside of them. But I mean, those filters, Rbj filters, especially back in the early days of plugins and so on, they were everywhere. And the SVF filters that Andy sort of came up with, they don't suffer from that. And the other thing that's better about them as well is the noise performance of them. So again, this is a bit technical, but the noise performance, if you're using, I think it was sort of standard floats with SVFs, is much better than using biquads, the Rbj biquads. That's not such a problem in ReaPIR because the basic number precision in ReaPIR is doubles, as far as I'm aware. So that issue doesn't really matter. But it was those two things. It was the stability under modulation. It was the I mean, they're really easy to derive as well. It's like just a handful of codes to implement, a handful of lines to implement them, and then the noise floor sort of thing.
Is there a drawback? So like yes. It has. Okay.
For me there was, and the drawback is that as soon as I started to try and visualize the filters, drawing the bands and the filter response line and so on, you need some way of deriving that. So you need a function where it works in a different sort of domain for the filter, where instead of the filter acting on a signal, working in the kind of sort of signal domain, it acts in the sort of time domain, where you need to get the magnitude at any sort of given point, which is what you need to draw the filter. You need the magnitude, and then you can work that out into screen coordinates and come up with some sort of visualization for it. And it wasn't there for SVFs. There's no to magnitude. A lot of the Rbj cookbook filters come with a magnitude thing, where you just give it whereabouts you are in the sort of filter, as it were, and it throws you back a magnitude number. But there was nothing like that for SVF, and I searched high and low looking for one. I tried to come up with it myself, and I think I ended up on a KVR audio developer plugin forum, and somebody just said, "Oh yeah, don't bother, you can't do that." And that was after some weeks of trying to do it, and I was like, "Oh right, okay, that really sucks." So what am I going to do about visualizing these filters? And I took a bit of a hacky approach, bit of a shortcut sort of hacky approach. It turns out that SVFs have got the benefit of they use less sort of noise reduction if you're using floats, and also they're more stable. But the actual shape of the curves are almost identical to Rbj cookbook curves. So if you look at the ReEQ source code, what I actually do, I sort of cheat, and that is I use the SVFs for processing, and I use the Rbj cookbook biquad formulas for visualization and rendering. They're actually the same, but so or at least the output's the same. It's only when you get down to the nitty-gritty of audio processing that you really get the benefits from the SVF. In terms of visual, they're just the same.
Yeah, I was doing a bit of research into this myself because I wanted to learn how you can draw these curves, and I actually found that thread that you started back in 2018. And one idea that I had is something that you may have tried, and I want to run this by you because maybe you tried and it works or it doesn't work, which is to just send an impulse and get the frequency response. And because you're only doing it once, you can have a huge number of beans, so the resolution will be good, and you can draw a smooth curve, and it will be great. And you can even use the real filters, the SVF filters, instead of the Rbj filters. Do you think that would work?
No, it doesn't work. I tried it. So where that works really well is in, say, really visual, like synthesizer or something like that, like Serum or Vital, something like that, where you've got those visualizations for the filters, for like the ladder filters, that sort of thing. That works really well there because you can throw any kind of filter in there and you can visualize it without using any hideous mathematics or anything like that. However, those displays for those programs are normally much smaller, and the problem when you're using a bigger display for like a parametric EQ, which uses a much bigger screen area, is you do suffer from the resolution, particularly as you get lower. You really suffer quite a lot from the resolution, and the amount the amount that I was having to sort of kind of split it up and refine it. I even tried using sort of cubic or quadratic curves to try and smooth it all out, but then that wasn't really depicted the frequency properly. There were some issues as well, as I remember, around peak bands with narrow Q sort of settings. there was all sorts of issues that came with it. It's a good thing for certain cases, like I've said, for rendering filter, you know, sort of synthesizer filter visualizations, but it just didn't really cut it out. I have a sneaky feeling some of the waves, older, you know, the really old waves things might have done that back in, because some of their linear EQ, I think, does that, and it does produce some odd results that you wouldn't get from just, you know, calculating the frequency response.
And did you consider working with filters that would have linear phase or zero phase? Was that something that you looked into?
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole separate sort of ball game, really, to do that. I must admit, I did look into it a year or two ago to see if it would be an easy thing to kind of fit in. It's not, as it turns out. It's quite a difficult thing to put in, and it can be quite, you know, it's quite a performance-heavy thing. It almost requires a complete. It's almost like a completely different kind of filter engine to make that happen. Mm-hmm. You know, some of the guys that implement that sort of stuff, like the Fabfilter guys, and that, they make it look so easy. It's just a setting at the bottom that you change it, and it's like using almost like a completely different engine to do it. It's it's a completely different way of doing it. So, I mean, I mean, who knows? Never say never, but, you know, put it behind the dynamic EQ.
And another one of the threads that I found from you from many years ago was related to how to get a zero latency filter that would not cramp near Nyquist. So the solution in ReEQ, and as far as I'm aware, the solution in EQ8 in Ableton is the same, just oversample. But did you find something else since then?
There's all sorts of stuff. So yes, I mean, I think I said, you know, initially one of my inspirations was to at least do something natively for ReaPIR that was as good as EQ8. And fortunately, you know, with EQ8's filters in the bag, that's what I set off to do, because it's Andy Simper's filters that are actually in EQ8 in Ableton. But again, you're right. You're quite right. You've got this sort of whole cramping thing at Nyquist, which is just the way that the mathematics work out for these kind of filters. And you'll notice that a lot of you know, really good commercial offerings like DMG Audio, Equilibrium, and Fabfilter, and Crave, and a whole bunch of other ones, they kind of solve this. And I set about doing it, and again, it's a huge set of rabbit holes again about academic papers that people have published trying to correct it. There's loads of different ways of doing it. They've all got flaws and caveats. The actual algorithms and the way that they're done in Fabfilter and the other, you know, commercial top grade EQs are all trade secrets. But I remember there's a great EQ that I sometimes use as well called Crave EQ. And I remember the guy there, he was blogging about it, and he spent a year coming up with the math to straighten the filters out and cramping Nyquist. So it's actually not a trivial problem. You have to sort of alter the phase of the filters for all the different shapes that you've got as they approach Nyquist and sort of recompute them that way. And then that alters the phase at higher end, which may or may not be noticeable. And it's really quite complex. So I had to make a choice whether was I going to just, you know, eat math for a year, try and fix that one, or, you know, there's this oversampling solution. It's kind of good enough for EQ8. You know, and there are no phase issues with it. There's about 16 sample latency, but no phase issue at all. It's really, really clean. And anybody who's working at higher sample rates in ReaPIR anyway, doesn't, you know, it doesn't affect them at all anyway. So I took the coding wise the easy route out and went with the oversampling. Who knows if I can actually? If I've got tons of academic white papers on it and so on, but if I can actually come up with the math, some of the shapes are good. You know, there's the math there for the peaks and you know, the cutoffs and you know, the high low pass, high pass, and but it's missing for things like shelves and it's just it's quite a thorny one.
So it seems like you're not in the business of designing filters too much. You're just in the business of bringing the filters to the masses.
Yeah, you got it. I'm setting the filters free to the suspecting public. That's what I'm doing.
And there's something to be said about this, because you're developing open source software, and it seems like in the audio programming industry, there is a lot of secrecy going on. And in some cases, that's good because you have to make money. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to do the things that you do. But on the other hand, it does set back some of the evolution that could happen in the field. So how do you feel about this secrecy versus openness, and what are your thoughts in this space?
Yeah, so well, it's always been the case. I mean, it's not just for audio software; it's software in general. I mean, the whole open source thing has just exploded massively over the last sort of 20 years or so, hasn't it? But there are still big, heavyweight sort of commercial companies out there, and their source code and their libraries, they're proprietary. And you've got companies like Native Instruments, say. It's almost unthinkable that they would open source any of their software. It's such a, that's just not in their DNA, as it were. And it'd be difficult as well because they use things like, Qt for their user interfaces, and that's a big commercial thing with heavy duty licensing, and and that's probably the other thing as well. A lot of these the companies out there that are making plugins and software tools and so on are using heavy duty licensed commercial grade platforms, tooling, all that sort of thing. So in a sense, they're not really geared for exposing much of what they do via open source. And I guess for them, at the end of the day, these companies are big business. So they'd have to be thinking, okay, what's the incentive for big business to be open sourcing all of our proprietary software, However, having said that, it's worth searching. One of the first ports of call for any kind of DSP work is GitHub, because there's a phenomenal amount of stuff on GitHub. I mean resources, for example. Matt Titel's Vital. That's open source. That's on GitHub. Vital Synth, that's a full-blown commercial synth, easily goes toe-to-toe with Serum, and it's open source. You can just go and look at it. There's loads of plugins. Another great resource for plugins on GitHub is VCV, the sort of virtual modular synth. There's tons of plugins for that on GitHub, and there's some fantastic DSP in those that's worth an evening or two sort of poring over. So yeah, I think from the enthusiast sort of merging into sort of becoming professional, we're going to continue to see open source. From the big companies coming down, I don't know. I guess it's not going to change much.
We got a couple of chat questions. One of them, I think, one of them is to you, Justin. I think we already kind of answered it, which is, talking about some EQs having like a compression per band or some saturation. Yeah. And if you have any plans of implementing that into ReEQ, which I guess, they should stay in line before dynamic, I guess.
Add it to the list. I have had some thoughts about saturation, about implementing saturation. That might even be more, I need to think about it a bit more. That might be more straightforward than the dynamic EQ. So it might nudge ahead of it, but it's, never say never on that. I'm a bit of a sucker for good saturation, so, and distortion. So, but I don't know, you got to think, what's ReEQ's thing in life? Is it to be a nice, clean, transparent digital EQ? Or is it, to generally add, can it be used as well to add color? Are those things aligned, or is it, just on that sort of front, actually, it's worth mentioning another JSFX developer who features a lot on the forums. I think I've got his name right. Is it Psych?
Psych, yeah.
His stuff, he's just incredible. The man's a machine. He's JSFX. Again, all JSFXs that anybody getting into DSP can go and look at his code. But he's got, a multi-band distortion thing. I remember talking with him about how to do the sort of band splitting on that one. But yeah, it's just his stuff's phenomenal. So if anybody is on the lookout for a really commercial grade multi-band splitter where you can apply distortion and various effects to each band, I recommend going and looking at his stuff, because he's got it.
I also, just because I know a few people are probably wondering in the chat, when it comes to the difference between multiband compression and dynamic EQ, am I correct to understand that the difference is, just from having kind of worked with them? I mean, I'm in no, like, I'm not at the level of writing any of them, but to me, it's like a dynamic EQ. You can turn the incoming signal down. Dynamic EQ is still active when that band becomes active, so it doesn't change when when the overall signal goes down. Whereas multiband compression has a threshold. So if the incoming signal goes down and is no longer exceeding the threshold, it's no longer active. Is that right?
Kinda. I would just describe. I would just describe a dynamic EQ in terms of what it does. Is it's using some of the similar DSP to a compressor. Sometimes it's more simplified than a compressor. So, for example, if you look at Pro Q3's controls, it's a very simple sort of compression DSP that they use. Whereas if you look at something like Nova, then that's a bit more fully featured, fully fledged. So the DSP is the same. It's what it's affecting that changes. So often in the case of, in dynamic EQ, you're affecting the magnitude of a band, say. So if you've got a peak, say like you're going to use dynamic EQ for some de-essing or something like that, you've got the you'll sort of be drawing. You've seen the curve for the filter, maybe a dip, sort of peak, negative sort of peak filter, and how much of that's actually applied will be being triggered by the DSP. For the compression DSP. I mean, it's essentially it's the same kind of DSP, but like saying, whereas a compressor itself would just be working on the amplitude of the whole signal. In a dynamic EQ, it's just the DSP is affecting the magnitude or amplitude of the filter. Yeah, it's the same kind of trigger. It's the same thing it's just what it's applied to is different.
I see. Okay, that's really cool. Somebody else had a question. Oh, somebody said ReEQ and Fruity parametric EQ2 matching, but then I guess it turns out that they meant ReEQ and not ReEQ. But I'm assuming your ReEQ, and maybe you've done some tests on this, would be pretty close to Ableton EQ8, for example, right?
Yeah. So when I was starting to implement all this DSP, I was, I went on a big EQ comparison sort of mission, and as the folks out there probably know, the way that you can do that, especially if you've seen a recent Dan Worrell video which he made a short while back, is you can get a lot of these EQs to null. So, which was interesting because, there are all sorts of people on forums saying, oh, this EQ's, it's super transparent, or it's got this weight in the back end, or all sorts of phrases that get bandied around in general audio sort of forums and what have you. But when it actually comes down to it, you do a null test, which is an inverse sort of polarity test, and it will tell you if there are any differences or not. And in most of the EQs out there, to a certain degree, they null, or they come as near as damn it to nulling, which means it's the same kind of math, the same formula. Where it becomes different, for example, if you can get ReEQ to null with a lot of commercial grade sort of things, where it'll become slightly different is if you try and get it to null with Pro Q3 at a higher frequency. Whereas Q3's got math there where it's affecting the phase of the curves and so on to straighten them out near Nyquist. ReEQ either doesn't do that or it'll use oversampling to do the same. So you'll get more differences if you do a null test at the higher frequencies. But once you're in the sort of middle of the screen of the the frequency range with band EQs, they come close as damn it to nulling out completely.
That's cool. Yeah. Speaking of Dan Worrell, I know he's from Leeds. I'm detecting in your accent maybe Birmingham, that general area of Leeds, like Sheffield. Am I right? Am I in the ballpark?
Well, yeah, you're right in terms of north. I'm Nottingham.
Nottingham. Okay, cool. Yeah, it's magic in the air around there in terms of DSP legends.
Yeah, isn't Dan in Sheffield? I think he might be Sheffield.
I guess his studio is in Leeds, so I always assumed he's also from there. But yeah, maybe he's in Sheffield. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool stuff happening there. Overall, I think like a lot of people who are really good at explaining audio in like like kind of away from those phrases you were mentioning earlier. Oh, this one is like got a tape warmth, or like those kind of loosely defined adjectives. It seems like maybe it's just something about England. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but like a lot of British content creators and DSP makers, they're like a lot better at like getting really scientific with it, versus I feel like in North America, there's a lot of people with tons of experience doing it, so they can be like, do this, do that, but the way they explain it is actually like possibly less than scientific.
Well, it could be. I mean, how do you explain it if you haven't got the scientific terms? That the problem is that it can be so subjective, and all sorts get said about audio, in forums and what have you, using these kind of terms about, oh, it's weighty in the bottom end, or it's pristine and crisp at the highs, or it's got this presence in the middle, and all these sort of things. But they're not really empirical as such. They're not, they're just like, well, I didn't think it was weighty in the bottom end, and I didn't think it sizzled at the top end. They're kind of subjective. I mean, what seems to have happened a lot on Gearspace, as it's now called. A lot of the times when plugins come out, or synthesizers or anything like that, is, the classic one was the difference between classic hardware like analog synthesizers and plugins and so on. Yeah. And everybody's, somebody who's just, bought a secondhand Minimoog for, thousands, is less likely to admit that, the Mini 5 from Arturia or Diva or Monarch or whatever stands toe to toe with it. I mean, it's like sacrilege. And,
exactly.
People complain about it, but then somebody will go and this should happen loads. People will put up, snippets, WAV files, where they're taken and they've, done various samples, and you've got to guess which one's the real Minimoog and which one's Diva or Monarch or whatever it is. They always get it wrong. Nobody can, almost down to a T, when push comes to shove, nobody can tell. And this is audio enthusiasts sat there, trying to really, really figure out which one's which. Never mind when it's actually in a track or in a mix or being used,
Right.
So yeah, and it's, I'm not saying that some hardware doesn't import, like the kind of coloration and things that you can only get from that hardware. But digital's, the modeling of it comes really close these days, really close.
That's one of the experiments I want to, it's more of a social experiment, like I always think about doing, which is write a plugin, very simple, like a one knob plugin, and release it for free, release it for $5, release it for $50, and then compare the reviews. Because I do feel like you say, it really does come down to people like paying for something, like admitting that there's a equivalent free version or an equivalent version costing like a tenth of that, would be kind of admitting that they suck. And I don't really even see it like that, because I still like sound the part. I want a Moog synth so I can play, like it's tactile. So I'm not going to pretend though that like, oh, the sound is somehow doing some magic. Or even sometimes people say, oh, you need a real lexicon. It's like, there's no such thing. The lexicon was like digital from the beginning. It's like a digital.
Absolutely. So, I mean, that was one of the, I mean, that thread on Gearspace went on and on and on. So it was people, I think it was the PCM 90, something like that lexicon. And, people were gushing over the hardware from yesteryear, that there's no replacement for it and it's incomparable, and they were doing these tests on there. And I think even the guy at Lexicon who programmed it chimed in and said, look, plugins, we used exactly the same algorithms as the box. It was digital.
Yeah.
And the box, as it turns out, was inside it was running Windows NT. You know, and they just use the same algorithms in the software. Yet people were swearing blind there was some kind of some magical difference.
Yeah, it's just digital, just has a casing around it, and it looks like it's made in, you know, it was made in, I think, like mid 90s, so it looks kind of old, but it's not analog by any means, you know.
No, not at all. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, it's a digital reverb. I mean, that's it. It's a digital reverb, you know. I suppose you can make an argument for like spring reverbs and, you know, genuine plate reverbs, but not a pure digital, you know, PCM reverb. Yeah, no case at all.
Bo is trying to nudge us towards getting into some actual coding.
Right, so how about we go to I'll be back screen, and we do a little bit of setup to share a coding thing between ourselves.
Yeah, we can give it a go.
All right, so we'll be right back.
Everybody.
Anything. Hello, we are back, and this is some coding that we are going to do together.
Okay. Well, it's kind of the candy's kind of done, but we can certainly do some extra things with it. I suppose I've done enough just to kick it off. But I suppose we can go through it, and we'll go through maybe sort of my process on some of the things I've been doing over in sort of synthesizer land, and how I use JSFX as a prototyping tool for that. And you should be able to run it as well and sort of see the results of it.
Oh yeah, so how about we start with that actually. I have here a ReaFIR instance, and I am going to create a new effect.
Wait, why am I not seeing you do your thing on the screen? Boop, 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 boop.
You mean you don't
okay, I'm seeing your screen. I'm seeing your screen, yeah.
Okay, so are you seeing my screen or Justin's screen?
I'm seeing your screen.
Okay.
I am actually seeing Justin's screens also. I think on the 4-person split screen, it's a bit small. It may be a trouble for people to reach. So why don't we full screen that, and we can be kind of small on the side or whatever. Because who needs to see my face for a quarter of their screen?
I mean, I'm making the text really big, so we can do that as well. But if you want me to, I can make my screen full size, and I can make everyone else smaller, and I can fit us in the corner.
Yeah, because I even have really good eyesight, so I know if I struggle, other people may as well.
Yeah, I am moving us around.
I have a surgically enhanced eyesight.
And Justin will be above you because I think that's the best layout for the text on the screen as well. How about that?
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. So
there we go. Yeah.
Here we are. This is the plugin. I just saved it, and let's see it in action.
How exciting!
Huh?
There we go. There it is. So if you press, you've got a MIDI keyboard close by, you can press.
I'm not gonna grab a MIDI keyboard. I'm gonna do this if you don't mind.
All right, do it from the sure.
Oh, I always forget that I have to enable the track for the MIDI to go through. Now it should go through. Oh, it's monophonic.
Yes, it's monophonic. So the idea with this is not to build a full-blown sort of polyphonic synthesizer per se. It's really just to work on an oscillator, really, which is as I'm sure you know, is the core sound generator for any synthesizer. So the idea is to start really simple. So in this JSFX, there's essentially one slider, which is just a gain control, really simple gain control, nothing to it. And all it's set about to do is just to implement the simplest kind of wavetable that you can, which is really a sine wave, which is what you can hear as you sort of press the buttons on. It's just a simple sine. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly run through the code. Oh, can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
You got me there?
Yes.
Yep. Right. Okay. So again, from the top, so we've got a simple slider, which is just going to be the gain. It's just a placeholder thing. A few simple variables, and then the first function is going to build the wavetable up. Yeah. So if you look at what that does, all it's doing is we've got a wavetable size, which is 2048, which is a standard size in a lot of synths for wavetables. And all we're doing is we're just populating that table with sine values.
Okay, so the wavetable size is the number of samples in the wave.
That's right.
Okay.
So a wave is really just internally it's just a block of memory, and the values in the wave range from -1 up to +1, and that's just standard waves. That's standard sort of samples really. So anyway, it's filling that with the sine value. So if you were to sort of look at what's actually in that table, you'd be able to plot it out as a sine wave essentially. And as you play it, that's characteristically what you're hearing. It's a classical sort of sine wave sound. Have you got? There we go. That's about as simple as it gets. So I'll tell you what we'll do. Coming down from that, I'll explain the rest of the code first, and then we'll see if we can do something else. So,
okay,
we've got a simple thing in. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, I was asking you if you want to go to the block or if you want to go to the sample block first.
Yeah, I was going to let's go to block and talk about the MIDI.
Yeah, sure.
Get that out of the way, because there's not a lot of focus on MIDI in this. It's just super simple. So you can see there's two functions there, super simple, note on, note off. And then there's a numeric MIDI note that gets passed in. It sets a few global variables up. It sets a variable called note gate, which is going to be 0 or 1. Let's see. So depending whether it's going to make a noise or not. And then you see there's a frequency calculation there, which is taking the MIDI note and actually working out the frequency of it.
I see.
Yeah. And then it's resetting a phaser, and then the phaser increment is how fast we're going to move through the wave to play it. That will become clear down in the sample block down below. But so in note on, that'll set it for note on. Note off sets it for off. It really, most importantly, sets the note gate to 0, so it doesn't play anymore. And then there's a while loop there in the block, which takes the MIDI, any MIDI coming into ReaPIR, and it just checks really whether it's a note on, a note off. And if it's not any of that, then we're not interested in it. It just sends it through. It just sends it on to the next thing using MIDI send.
Yeah, for people who have been following our streams, something that we have never worked with is MIDI. And the MIDI facilities in ReaPIR are very bare bones. You just get the number. A MIDI message is just a number, and you just get the number, and you have to do all the parsing of the MIDI message yourself. So this is just in checking whether this is a MIDI message that is turning a note on. And then he's calling the note on function with that. But other than that, if it's not a message that we recognize, if it's not a number that we know how to deal with, we are just going to forward this because maybe the next guy in the chain is going to know what to do with it.
That's it. That's exactly it. And that's about as much MIDI as I do in this thing as well, because that's you know, having some MIDI that gates a note on or off is about as simple as it gets. So, and that's fine because the main focus of this is the wavetable oscillator. So that's fine. There was just enough MIDI there to be able to play a note and stop playing a note. That's it. I mean, obviously, if you start implementing things like polyphony and goodness knows what else, it can become a bit more complicated. But that's the bare bones.
Speaking of more complicated, I have a feature request for you, Justin, for your wavetable synth. And that is, like overall, I think this would be just from having done like some work in Max MSP, I know this is totally possible to do, but I think most synthesizers out there don't implement it. Like what they do is that they have they divide the spectrum, they set A as 440, and then they divide the spectrum by 128 MIDI notes, and then they give you those frequencies. So what I always have been really interested in is, because, once you get outside of like equal tempered music with 12 tones and stuff, when you get to like microtones and stuff like that, but also for people who want to use their voice as input, I've always wanted like a synth that takes its pitch of the oscillator or the frequency of the oscillator, takes that info from the voice. So kind of a reverse vocoder, instead of taking frequency from MIDI and then using like taking envelope information from the voice, doing the reverse of that. So if I take my voice and I go, ooh, like it actually follows those frequencies rather than gliding through the notes, or rather than passing through these 128 MIDI note ons, it just follows the frequency content of the voice, maybe finds a fundamental and tracks that, so that you can put like somebody singing like a raga, like an Indian raga, where they have those like quarter tone modulations, and it can just play that. Is that like, does that make sense? All the stuff I just said?
Yes, it does. No, that's fascinating. That'd be a fascinating feature. I suppose the closest I've seen to anything like that would maybe, Ableton's got a thing where it can convert an audio file to sort of MIDI notes. It's kind of along those sort of lines, I guess, where you'd be taking the input, converting to sort of a MIDI, or at least the pitch anyway.
Well, even in those cases, it kind of quantizes like all the frequencies into one of 128 notes. So you can do, you can do 440 and then whatever A sharp is maybe like 460. But if there was a way to use the voice to control the oscillator to sing, if somebody's able to sing like 450 and then go to 445, 445, 446, you know what I mean? So actually being able to travel completely across the frequency spectrum, working, like inputting the frequency into the voice oscillator, if that makes sense. So even like with all of these audio to MIDI features, you are immediately constrained to the notes within the 12-tone equal tempered scale that we have available. But there's not a lot of stuff where you can sing a C and a quarter, and it just will be able to output that note using the oscillator. But knowing that oscillators start from frequency and actually don't really have a notion of pitch, I always wondered why more synths don't implement this, where you can just use take frequency content instead of taking pitch information from the voice, if that made sense.
Well, it's a fascinating feature. There you go, voice-controlled oscillator. To my synth in the next 2 years.
I guess in essence it's just changing this part of the formula to be the result of a pitch tracking kind of algorithm.
Yeah.
No, that'd be cool. So anyway, I guess well, I've made that is an interesting thing. I'll do some research on that.
Cool.
But so coming back to this, I guess we're at the @sample sort of part now. Yep. There we go. I can just about see it. Right. Okay. So what's happening in the @sample? This is the part of the JSFX that's actually doing the the sound generation, as it were. That's going to be outputting. In our case, SPL0 and SPL1, which is the sort of left and right sort of stereo sample outputs down at the bottom there. So what it does to get that, it needs to work out whereabouts we're scanning the wavetable. So we've already set the frequency that we're going through the wavetable in order to relate to the pitch that we've hit with a MIDI note. We've already done the math there in Note On. So what it has to do, it has to work out, right, okay, the wavetable size is 2048, and we've got to work out where is our phase within that. Now, interestingly, you can be like between two sample points in the wavetable. You can say halfway along or whatever. So what it has to do, the next few lines of code are about sort of flooring or rounding down, as it were, whereabouts we're on the sample table, taking the next sort of sample and then working out if we're a fractional value in between them, just as a straight linear interpolation. So if you look at what happens there with S1 and S2, they get two wavetable samples, and frac is worked out in the next line where it begins S equals. It's just a straight linear interpolation between those two samples in the wavetable. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, like Serum has that where you can or you can even modulate it, but you can even if your wavetable has, say, like 4 samples in it, or I don't know what the minimum is, maybe it's 32, you can still go kind of in between them. You still get that control.
Right. Yeah, hold that thought, because that comes along a bit later. That's actually to do with whole wavetables. At the moment, what we're dealing with is just the individual samples within a wavetable.
I have a question about this.
We're even lower. Okay.
Yeah.
When I have a very old video on my channel. It was back when I didn't even have the setup to do streams, so I was kind of pre-recording my live coding streams. In any case, I did an oscillator there, and what I did is not to use a wavetable. I just computed the sine of whatever value I needed. And I would essentially take the phase and compute the sine of 2 times pi times that. And it performed kind of okay. But this strategy, I suppose, is going to be much faster. So Can you speak to how dumb my original idea was, or maybe it's used somewhere in some context?
Yes, absolutely. So some synthesizers do work like that. They compute the standard waveforms, like sine waves, sawtooth, pulse, that sort of thing. They actually compute them live without storing them. Often tables are even used in those cases, just because it's fast to look up the tables and to work with them rather than using the mathematical functions like sine to compute them. That question actually will become more relevant in the next iteration of this code. So if you hold that thought, we'll come back to it.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll make.
And
a lot more
with
sense.
wavetable, you can use your own voice as what the oscillator would use.
You get a whole world of flexibility all of a sudden. But I will briefly mention, the native sort of ways of generating oscillators outside of wavetables.
And I have another question, actually, before we move on. We are using linear interpolation, and that's not the only kind of interpolation. It's probably the simplest, but it's not the only one. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of the different kinds of interpolation, from sync and some polynomials and the linear one?
That's a really good question. So the advantage of this one is that it's fast. Is that there's a couple of there's an addition, a subtraction, and a multiply, so that's really quick. So between the two samples, it's really fast. There are all sorts of, like you say, there are cubic interpolations, there are all sorts. The Lagrange integration, they're all heavier duty in terms of the math that's involved and so on, and the number of additions, subtractions, and multiplies that are generally taken. So that's all I would say. This is good enough. Some of the early wavetable synthesizers back in the day, they wouldn't actually even interpolate. They would just take the one that's in flooring. They wouldn't interpolate between two. They would just take the first one and run with that. You can try that out. It comes with horrible artifacts actually, but some of them had it. That's the way they did it because the hardware they were doing it on was so low tech, so primitive and slow that. That's just the way that they did it. But the linear interpolation here, it generally works pretty well.
Okay.
And it's fast.
And is it the kind of interpolation that you use in the oversampling for ReEQ?
No, that's we didn't talk too much about that, did we? That's a whole different ball game, actually. The oversampling is quite a tricky thing in ReEQ. It's essentially using something called a Fabfilter, which is a finite impulse response filter rather than a infinite input response filter like the actual filters themselves are, which is why it introduces latency, and it uses a scheme whereby because it goes at kind of double the rate. It uses the sample that's been processed from the filter interspersed with zeros, and filters are run over those, and then the Fabfilter's applied at the end, which cuts it off, and then it all kind of scales back down in a really sort of clean, efficient way. So it's a different ball game altogether. This is just really straightforward linear interpolation.
Got it. Okay. And for people who want to learn more about finite impulse response filters versus infinite impulse response filters, you can go way back in this same channel when we did our first stream together, I think.
Oh, we have actually all those links still in the description of all the streams.
Oh, so there you go.
All the
Arya
stuff we mentioned, still below.
Okie doke. Right. Well, as you can see there, so we get, we sort of get our sample that's somewhere in between, say, two samples, or in some cases on a sample from the wavetable, and we just feed it straight through to SPL0, SPL1, and that produces the noise, that produces the sound, the sine wave, the classical sine wave that you hear.
So the cool thing about this is that the oscillator is always running. We are not hearing the oscillator, but it's always running. The reason why we don't hear it is because of this noise gate that was very cleverly manipulated by the node on and node off functions. And this is just muting the sound, but it is still going while we speak. This is running. This code is running on my machine right now.
All the time. Absolutely, and interestingly, it's kind of a bit of a cheapskate thing really to put in, but it's kind of how the old electric synthesizers worked. The oscillators were always running. It was just that they were affected further down the signal path by either a gate or by something like an envelope amplitude modifier. But the oscillators was just always on, essentially. So it's kind of a bit like that in a way. It's about the simplest it could be.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. Right, so that's it. So that was straightforward for this iteration of the code. That was kind of like, really straightforward. You've got the simplest sound with the simplest MIDI loop, and it plays at different frequencies, and that's kind of all good. You've got an oscillator, a playable oscillator. Am I okay to paste in the next iteration?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
And because we are doing this everything in ReaPIR, maybe you could just send me the files. But yeah, we already have the code share set up. So just paste the code here and I will paste it to the right place.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay,
and if you
so
can, maybe share the files later with Arya and he can put all the different versions that we are going to go through in the description.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, I think that the new version is here, right?
Yep. That's it. Now it's almost identical to the other one. The only change is that we've decided to add a different kind of wave into the wave table. So instead of a sine wave, we've added a sawtooth wave.
Cool.
So if you look at build wave table, you're now passing a number, and it's 0 for sine, 1 for sawtooth. Yeah.
Cool.
So this is the original one, and this is the new one. And let's hear it.
That's the only change. So if you start lower down on the keyboard, yeah, that's a much buzzier sort of sound than the sine wave we had. Yeah. There we go. Sawtooth. Now, the problem will come is if you start to play that further up the keyboard. Ooh, there we go.
We heard the lower pitches, right?
Well, what's happening there is you're hearing aliasing.
Yeah.
That's the aliasing.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Let me bring my favorite spectrum analyzer. I want to see that.
Yeah, I could hear the pitch as we went up for sure.
Yeah. Ooh, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's hear everything to compare. So I'm going to mute the master because it's kind of annoying to hear these tones, but let's see how it behaves in the lower frequencies. Kind of nice. And then going up. And I can start to see some of the fold in the aliasing thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes back here and it actually goes back up again.
So because it's all odd harmonics, right, on a sawtooth, so then once it exceeds Nyquist, like multiple versions of those are folding back into the audible spectrum, right?
You've got it. So if you so here we go. Here's something we should have probably done first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post the original back into CodeShare.
Oh, you don't have to do that. We can fix this real quick just by commenting out this part, right? Or even better.
You're absolutely right. Build wave table 0. You're absolutely right. Build wave. Yeah. Well, you don't need to comment it out where it says build wave table 1.
You have it in the function.
Yeah. Just change it to 0. Of course, there's nothing else different in this one. So that's a sine wave.
I'm going to do a full compile reset here because I don't trust ReaPIR enough. So that looks nice. That looks like a pure sine wave.
Exactly. So this is the thing with the sine wave. That's why we don't hear the aliasing, because the sine wave is only present on the fundamental of the note. There are no additional harmonics. Yeah. So that's why we got away with the sine wave, but we can't get away with the sawtooth. It's aliasing. It's a digital artifact. And it's right. It's because a sawtooth, if you look at the spectrum for a sawtooth, no matter where you play it, it generally extends way past Nyquist at the end. And left unhandled like that, it essentially reflects back into the audible spectrum range, which you can see if you look. You can see the peaks of the harmonics going up to Nyquist, and then you can almost see it like reflecting back, and you get all sorts of nonsense in there as it comes back. And and particularly when those frequencies that are folding back become loud or start getting close to the fundamental, that means we can hear those sort of that sort of screeching sort of pitch, those pitchy sort of screeching sounds.
Something that would be important to add is like on a lot of synthesizers, your sawtooth is not a true sawtooth. They just draw the first like 32 or 16 or 8 overtones, odd harmonics, and then they just cut them off like manually, basically. And on something like the Ableton operator, you can actually choose like saw 4, saw 8, saw 16, saw 32.
Yeah, I think operators keeping with it. It's kind of like a little bit like an additive synth in the way that you can sort of edit the frequencies like that. Well, you're right. On some systems, it's if it's processed like that, they are kind of cut short. But we generated it programmatically, which means it's a perfect sawtooth. I mean, it's a sawtooth. It's one of the simplest shapes, but it's perfectly sort of generating the wavetable. But we're getting these horrible digital sort of aliasing artifacts.
Something I found interesting was when Leandro was playing something like a C3, you could see the harmonics kind of go down in amplitude, and then really kind of above 15K, they actually start going up as if they're getting so close to each other that they are, that's
exactly.
really cool.
That adds to it. Now, the interesting thing with this sort of thing as well is if you look at a lot of, really like, imported consumer electronics, doorbells and all sorts of different things, or buzzers, once you start listening to aliasing for a while, you can actually start hearing it all over the place in terms of, just generated from anything that does digital, buzzy sounds or whatever. Often you'll hear aliasing. It's just part of it being a digital artifact.
It sounds like this.
Those
oh man.
If they were a little tuned, actually, I would really dig that too. And like I would use aliasing, and I don't know, is there a way to like kind of, I'm supposing there is, just by some maths, like figure out what's gonna alias and then tune that?
Well, the closest I've seen to that is I think one of Waldorf's new synthesizers is like a more advanced version. I'm trying to think, is it the XT that's more advanced version, one of their older wave synthesizers? And the older wavetable synthesizer that they did have aliasing in it. They probably tried to reduce it in some way, but they didn't really crack it in that older synth. And the newer synth, obviously, which is, using a much better CPU underneath and so on, they actually put a feature in where you could turn up and down the volume of the aliasing. So if you wanted, you could have it completely out. But if you wanted it to sound like the predecessor synth from God knows 20 years ago, you could actually turn the aliasing back in. Because some of the enthusiasts for that particular synth from all that time ago have accepted it as part of the sound.
Right, yeah.
But to answer your question, Aria, of whether it's possible to calculate where the aliasing is going to happen and how, there is a way to calculate where the aliasing is going to happen, and it's actually rather straightforward. So if you see some wave that is aliased at, let's say, about here, 10K, you see a peak that is the result of aliasing. That is probably because there was some frequency that was supposed to be 30K, but because we are using a sampling rate that cannot represent 30K, it folds back to 10K. So, that's how it goes. It just folds right to left.
Yeah, no, I knew that. What I meant was like, so if one of the overtones, which is the, I don't know, 35th overtone, or just to make it easier, the 9th overtone is a tritone above the fundamental. If we could tune that to become a fifth once it aliases and wraps back down. Because you're doing a subtraction on something that multiplies. So if that could be kind of tuned, but I'm assuming not really, unless there was a way to actually tune the Nyquist to be an overtone of the fundamental itself and move with the fundamental. I don't know. I'm just seeing this from like a music perspective and without having much of an idea if these things are mathematically viable.
Right. Okay. Well, this is the next thing. So, I mean, obviously, if when you're designing an oscillator for use in a modern synth, you need to get rid of the anti-aliasing. Unless you want to do a Waldorf thing where you can dial it up and down, well, that's a different issue. Won't really worry about that. But it really is quite a problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste the next iteration in.
Oh, I thought you had already done that.
No, not yet. The one that's in. Sorry, there's a few iterations. So this is the next one. Oops.
Jacob in the comments is saying, I'm kind of shocked how quickly you can shoot yourself in the foot if you try to do naive solutions like linear sampling in a wavetable. Damn, yeah, shocking. This is also why open source software is so cool, because like we're so used to seeing the final product and thinking, oh, an EQ, right? It's just a volume knob for different frequencies. But once you get like under the hood and see how they're done, like I have such high respect for every EQ I see nowadays, because I'm like, that's some like real math happening. It's not a simple, it looks so simple on the user end, but writing this stuff is crazy. Just crazy.
Yeah, it is quite interesting how, I mean, literally it went wrong straight away using a sawtooth, right? It's literally the next thing that you try to do. You think, right, and now I'm going to build my synth, right, sawtooth, and then it just sounds horrible. Straight off the path. Okay, so right, there's a couple of modifications in this iteration, so I'll kind of go through them. One thing I could do with doing, I might be able to. We might have to do a little bit of setup for a file. Am I able to send a file?
Yeah. So how about you just send the file via Skype?
Yeah.
And we can talk about something that we have never done before in the stream, which is to use files. And
beautiful. Yeah.
That's the third kind of slider in JSFX. You have your good old sliders. You have your drop-down menus, and we looked at those in the past, but files is the third one, and we haven't ever played with this. We used it before in the stream. We used the amp simulator that comes with ReaFIR, and it's using different files, but we have never actually looked at the code to do this. So while Justin is getting the file my way, what I have to do on my side is I have to have a folder.
Skype, Justin.
Yep, so I've got Skype. We've got the chat. Do I do it through the chat?
Yeah, you can drop it on the chat, and I will get it, and I will put it in the right place. So as far as I remember, what I have to do is I have to go into my effects folder, into my ReaFIR installation, and in there I have to create a folder that matches this name.
No, there's actually no, that caught me out as well. It actually goes in a different place. So if you bear with me,
it goes into the data folder, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's in because I tried putting this to start with in the it's not in effects. It's in data.
Yeah, it's in the data folder. I misspoke. So you have to have a folder in the data folder that matches the name that you have here in the slider. And right. If you are distributing this using RePack, there is a way for you to specify JSFX files. These kinds of files, they are going to go into the effects folder, but you can also specify some files that are going to be data files, and then you can drop those into the data. RePack is going to drop those into the data folder.
Oh, you got to teach me that in detail later, because I think I can distribute my toolbars that way.
Yeah, it's something that I use. There is a feature request that I created. I wanted to be able to distribute effects chains. And as far as I can tell, that's not possible. So what I do is I distribute my effects chains as data, and I tell people go in the data folder and move that or copy that into the effects chain folder. And I don't know how to download the file.
From Skype?
Yes.
I think you just click on it.
But I don't see the file.
Oh, I don't see it either, actually.
Okay. I thought it was me being silly.
Yeah, Justin, we don't see your file.
Can you you can send me the file via email as well if you prefer.
Oh no, there we go.
Oh,
sorry.
Oh,
here
there
we are.
it is. Yeah.
So
yeah, you sort of drop it in, but then you've got to hit send as well. Right, okay, my bad.
Oh, that's right.
I saved it to downloads, and now I am going to go to my downloads folder, but I don't want everyone in the world to see what is up in my downloads folder. So I'm opening it on the other screen. But here it is, basic shapes. This is the file that Justin sent. And I am going to actually open this file in ReaFIR real quick so we can take a peek to see what's in there. I'm going to do this in a different track just in case. And this is what it is. Okay, that's a colorful file.
Nice. Did you write this, or is this from Serum's files?
It's Serum's.
Cool. Yeah, because it looked familiar to me.
Yeah.
Oh, and you got cool. So we got sine. We got after that we got the sawtooth. Then we got triangle. I'm assuming is up next. Then we got a square with a longer pulse width, and then we got a square with a shorter pulse width, and that be the and then lastly we got one last one in the end there.
What is this one?
That's just a shifted. Yeah, what's the last one? Is that just a phase shifted triangle?
I don't know.
Cool. Yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Just like a triangle at its starting from 90 degrees in its phase.
Okay, we got it all there. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
All right. Okay. So, what are we doing with this file?
Right. Just bear with me a minute, guys, as I get this on my screen as well.
So, I guess in other words, this file is a wave file that is a representation of the thing that we had before. Like in the code, we built with code a wave table that would produce this, and now we have it in a wave file instead.
That's right. It's just in the wave files there. So what I'm going to do, if you just bear with me, guys, while I load this up. Yeah, we'll run through it. So there's two additions to this one, so we've got a bit more to play with. So the first addition, as you've seen, is that we can now there's a function there which will load that wavetable file. So if you look underneath build wavetable, which we've still got in there, should we need it, there's a function called load wavetable. And this is just using the ReaFIR file loading things for loading WAV files and so on. It opens a file if it was successfully open, which we just more or less assume that it is. Then we get information about the file, the WAV file, like its sample rate and things like that. We're kind of, we take some shortcuts. We assume that the amount we can read from the file is going to be in multiples of 2048. So we're expecting a well-behaved wavetable file of the sort that Serum or Vital use. And then the file underscore mem actually reads it in, the actual raw data. And then we close it. That's it. That's how we load the wavetables. So that will load any Vital, Serum, whatever wavetable file if it's the right way. 2048 cycles for all the waves. Cool. So that's that. Then the next function there is the biggie. This is the one that does the work with respects to anti-aliasing. Okay. And this is probably the trickiest thing out of the whole project. So let's see if we can get through it. So what's happening here is we're taking a source wavetable and a frequency. Yeah. And generally, without getting into this code straight away, the idea is that we want some way of making sure that nothing that goes beyond Nyquist reflects back to produce the anti-aliasing. Yeah. And so how do we do that? Well, there's a number of ways of doing it. If we were generating the wavetables, or if we would say, like we mentioned before, if you were just computing them using sine or just computing the actual samples rather than reading them out, then there are other techniques you can use called bleps, min bleps, and so on. And what they do for certain shapes of wave, they look for the discontinuities in the wave, which is where the high frequency is introduced. And they modify the wave as it's read or calculated so that it reduces those generated high frequencies.
They kind of sand it off like as if it was like a sharp. Okay, cool.
That's what the blep things do. Yeah.
So in a wave that looks like this, for instance, it would look for this place where the discontinuity is, and it would smooth it out so it wouldn't be a jump that is, I guess this is probably one sample. No, it's two samples.
4 sample. No, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, yeah. So there are 2 samples in the middle, and it would put more samples in the middle to smooth this out so that the higher frequencies don't go through. Okay.
And sometimes the way they're generated, they're kind of, it's interesting. It's sort of like generated like in sort of ripples almost, which is what's required to reduce the high frequency content beyond a certain amount. And as far as I'm aware, what the bleps do is they don't get rid of all the aliasing, but they get rid of the worst of it. Yeah. The disadvantage is that they don't work generally. They work best for the simple shapes that that synthesizers classically produce. Pulse wave, sawtooth, things like that. They can look for those discontinuities that they're expecting in those waveforms, and then sort of almost insert the samples that they have to as it's being played to make sure that the high frequency doesn't get reflected back from Nyquist. So they don't work generally, as far as I'm aware, for a general case where you've got a wavetable and there could be anything in it. So there could be crazy things in there, because you've not got you can't rely on the same well-behaved saw, pulse, triangle, those sort of things. So that's why we don't really go that route for this kind of processing to get rid of this kind of aliasing.
Can I do an experiment real quick? Because everything we are talking about in essence boils down to you're getting this wave file, you're putting a EQ that is a low pass, and you're rendering the effect of that, right?
No. Yeah, the reason that won't work is because the EQ gets applied after the mathematics worked out and after the reflection actually happens. If that makes sense.
Well, but I'm using an EQ that is smart enough to not do that.
I mean, you could.
No, but like when you're generating the wavetable to, I think what Leandro is saying is you would render a new wavetable post EQ, and then you put that into your wavetable. But then in that case, if you still go up in pitch, you may still get aliasing. So you need to produce the oscillation and then deal with the aliasing, correct?
Yes, you have to. Yeah, you need a filter won't do it. So it can do it. So what happens in the case of like ReEQ for its oversampling, which uses a close to a brick wall filter to do the oversampling? Because otherwise, so what happens in ReEQ's case, the way that the math works out is that the beyond Nyquist is almost like a perfect mirror of what's before it, and if left untreated, it reflects back in and it's a complete mess. So what's employed is a FIR, it's called a Kaiser filter, a FIR Kaiser filter that's very steep, very close to Nyquist, and it's in the pipeline in such a way that all of that will get essentially filtered out. And by filtering, it means it pushes it right into the noise floor. So it's just a non-issue anymore. To do that with a wave, well, for a start, with synthesizers, you don't really want to introduce the latency that you'd get by doing that, by using a FIR filter. So FIR filters are out, and IIR filters don't happen at the right part of the signal path to enable that to happen. You can oversample and then try and filter out, but the problem is with that is that you might have to oversample ×2, ×4, and you're also altering the phase relationship of the wave as well. I think some synths do it that way, but that's not the way that I'm about to show.
Okay.
So I think, Leandro, in your method, for example, if we put that into an oscillator, and then if I tune the oscillator high enough, those extra samples that I created go back down to wrap into just being 2 extra samples. You know what I mean?
I see.
Play that 4 octaves higher. Yeah, you're back to square one. No pun intended.
Oh, and we see the ripple that Justin was talking about. So in the original signal that is grayed out here, the samples go from being at -1 to being at 0. And in this case, you can see the ripple. They go up and then go back down, and then they stabilize.
Yeah.
Right. So what is the secret sauce?
Here's the secret sauce. So what we needed to go, coming back to what we needed to do is to make sure that there are no frequencies above Nyquist that can reflect back and cause all that horrible aliasing. It needs to work for any kind of wavetable containing any kind of data with all sorts of discontinuities and goodness knows what in it. So it has to be general purpose. So bleps are out of the window. We can't use those. And it turns out there's something called FFT, fast Fourier transforms, that can come to the rescue. Now, I mean, FFTs are a huge subject. They're probably a bit, it's a bit much to get into the, all the ins and outs of them at the moment. But essentially, what we want to do is we want to convert our wave or our wavetable into the frequency domain. Yeah.
Yeah. People who are interested in the logic behind this and what it does and how it works can go to my channel. Last week we implemented not the FFT, but we implemented the the theory behind it, the DFT from scratch.
Great, exactly. So this is like following on from all of that, that sort of stuff. So the logic is that we want to take the wavetable, which is our sort of single cycle sample, and we want to convert it into frequencies that represent the whole sort of sample range up to Nyquist ×2. Yeah, and then if we zero out all of the frequencies, beyond Nyquist, and then convert it back into a single cycle wave
domain.
Yeah. Ugh. The way that works out is that we'll now have a wave table that is anti-alias, that has no frequencies reaching out beyond Nyquist.
Oh, let me see if I understand this. So I want to try my experiment again. Instead of using ReEQ, I am going to use a different fellow, ReaFIR. So this works with the same principle. You even get to choose the size of the window. And I can use it in EQ mode. I can put a very steep curve at this point. Probably as steep as it goes. So everything above this is going to be just cut off. And then I have good quality and everything. So I can just render this and look at it. And this is, let me get the windows out of the way. And this is what is actually going to be the wavetable that we are going to actually go over. Is that right?
I'm just trying to, it's a little bit small on my screen to see what you've got there. Is it, can you sort of zoom in on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Let me get some windows out of the way. Not that one. That one I want to keep.
So from what I can see, if you've rendered that out, you can see what I was talking about with the thing that MinBlebs try to do, which is that oscillation, that dying oscillation from the discontinuity. Yep. Meaning the way that we've done it, it's just the way that it sort of converts back from having zeroed out all of the frequencies beyond Nyquist, which is half the sampling rate. Yeah. So in theory, there's nothing to fold back. Now, when that's converted back, FFTs work sort of using like sine waves essentially. That's it. That's what you end up with, and that means that there's not going to be any frequencies that present at all to fold back. So it shouldn't have any aliasing.
So does this happen when you're playing the synth? This is like happening per MIDI event, let's say, correct?
Right. No. So this is the other thing we have to bear in mind. So this works. I mean, we'll sort of play it in a bit, and you'll see it fingers crossed it'll work perfectly. But working out an FFT all the time and doing the permutations and so on, working with the FFT, it can be a fairly heavy-duty thing to do. I mean, we're doing it on 2048, but it's converting those to complex numbers with a real and imaginary part, and then it's doing various sort of internal gubbins on it, and then converting it back. And if we were to do that, you could do that per, like you say, when you generate a note. But in a synthesizer, you'll want to start implementing things like portamento, things like that, or gliding pitch, or all sorts of other things that can affect the pitch.
Right.
So the strategy that I took, and I kind of borrowed a bit of a cue from the way that some of the UHE synths were doing it, like Hive and so on, as far as I can tell, and Zebra, is that you recompute this every, say, 256 actual samples or so in the main sort of at sample loop. So you're not doing
so
all
at the
time.
block in JSFX terms.
You kind of, although I generally do it inside the at sample because you've got finer control over how many samples it to the next one until it regenerates. And that kind of works okay. And if you use it, say, 256 every 256 samples, it does it. Then that, that refresh rate is high enough. And as I'll mention out in some of the other iterations, there's a lot of side benefits come from doing that as well. So you have to accept generally that it's not going to be calculated at what's called audio rate, but it's at a fine enough level that it's not going to. So for example, in the synth that I'm making, when it alters the pitch, like in a glide or anything like that, it does it as it going through sense, but it's not very long before another 256 samples have been played, and it plays it next to the closest pitch. So what
like that's 1/200th of a second, or something, right?
Yeah, so it's like it's the amount of samples. So if you think you've got your sample rate is 44,100 samples a second, It's 200 samples, 256 samples. So that kind of puts it in perspective. It's a
Yeah.
really short time, actually.
Awesome.
So
So actually per event is too slow.
Yeah. What's that? Sorry?
So actually, if you do that per MIDI note, that's like too slow for a synth.
Well, it won't let you. It needs to be more dynamic. It won't let you do things like note slides and things like that.
So it seems like I understood it wrong. It's not the case that the anti-alias function is called with the original file, the original basic shapes.wave, and then you just use that. No, you're using the basic shapes in pretty much the same way that we were using the wavetables up to this point, and the result of that you are passing through the anti-alias filter. Is that right?
Yes.
I had understood the wiring wrong. So my whole experiment here trying to come up with a wavetable that would not produce aliasing is just nonsensical. It doesn't make sense to think about it that way.
The way that it was affecting the discontinuity looked okay.
Okay.
The way that it sort of wobbled. That's kind of what happens.
Yeah, but it's misleading. So what I should be doing is just use the wavetable the same way we have been using the wavetable so far, and then feed the result of that into the anti-alias function, and then the result of that I can play. But there is no latency involved in the process because we can compute samples ahead of time. So usually in something like a compressor or limiter with look ahead, we would introduce latency to be able to hear the samples in the future. But that's not necessary because we are creating the samples with our loops, so we can look ahead.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes, that's right. So what we do, so if we go down to the sample section, sample section. So again, this is showing the process. So what I did there is I created a function called getSample, which is a thing that does the linear manipulation. It gets the actual sample on the wavetable. So that made things a little bit cleaner. And then I've got a thing called sample_count, which is essentially how many samples we've processed. And whenever that hits 0, then we're going to call anti-alias our current wave, and that's going to put it into the current play buffer for the wavetable at the frequency that we're currently at.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So this current wave is being created by calling getSample. Where is current wave being created? I cannot find it.
Right. So if you look, create wave. Where are you seeing create wave? Have you seen the same thing that I am?
He was talking about current wave. That's like an argument to anti-alias. He's asking where it's created.
Yeah. If you look where current, it's a little bit.
It's in the slider block. I think.
Current wave is at the top. It's just the 0. It's like the first. It's the first wave or whatever. Yep.
Okay, so current wave is a slice of our basic shapes wave file.
Yeah.
Okay.
If we so at the moment that it's like I say it's a little bit where are we? Plus floor slider 3. There we go. And if you look at current wave, it's actually set in the like I'm saying, it's set in. Is that the slider section? So
yes, that's the slider section.
Yeah, so it's working out which one it is. So so current wave is the one that we're playing, or that we want to play. Calling anti-alias is going to put it into the buffer that we actually play, the wavetable_play buffer. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you look, we check if we've got sample count, which is going from 0 to 256, then wrapping back to 0 all the time. Whenever it hits 0, we generate the anti-alias wave buffer that's called wavetable_play.
Mm-hmm.
And if you see in that sample, we get the sample from that using getSample, and we just play it like we did before. So the idea is inside that sample, we've got a thing that happens every 256 samples. It will recalculate an aliased wavetable based on our current frequency, plane frequency, and that's the one that it's playing.
Okay, so this wavetable play is the result of the anti-aliasing thing.
Yes, that's the result of it. Like I say, I could have maybe passed that into the anti-aliasing thing as a destination, but there you go.
So there you go.
A little bit hacked up.
Here it is. In the anti-alias function, there is a use of the global variable wavetable play, and that's the one in which we are doing the FFTs and the whole filter in a similar way that ReaFIR would do it.
That's right.
Okay.
That's awesome.
So it's got a pointer into the file of which wave we want to play that's coming from being calculated from the slider. Then every 256 samples, it's anti-aliasing, given as an anti-alias version of that, given a frequency, and that's the one that we play.
Oh, so the anti-alias is kind of working in the original wave file, because the current wave is a slice of the wave file, as we determined a moment ago. So it's kind of doing the thing that I showed before with ReaFIR on basic-shapes.wave, except that this anti-alias is not fixed. It's something that you keep doing every 256 samples, because the frequency, the cutoff frequency of this FIR filter needs to change. Is that right?
Of which FIR filter, sorry, are you referring to?
The anti-alias function is a FIR filter.
Yep.
And you have to keep calling it.
Yeah, it's not really. It's the crudest kind of filter. It's literally zeroing the bins in the FFT for the frequencies above Nyquist.
So I have a question about this. How do you actually get the frequencies above Nyquist to begin with?
Because the FFT that's been generated is for the whole sort of sort of frequency range, which is Nyquist times 2. Yeah, that's what it generates.
Okay. So
this is cool because this works. Like, I could theoretically record my cat's voice, and if I make the recording be a sample count that's divisible by 2048, I can already put it in this JSFX, and I could make sound with it, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
So if you look there inside anti-alias, where there's a variable called n, which is actually the sort of harmonic place. That's essentially a line which works out whereabouts in the whereabouts our harmonics are, given the frequency that we're playing at, is in there, and then zeros everything from the back end of that to the end to remove all of those frequencies. So it's essentially from Nyquist Plus, but it's actually from but it takes the frequency into account.
And the frequency that we are talking about here is the frequency that is related to the note you're playing?
Yes. So if you look if you remember in note on, that's where we work that out based on the MIDI. Okay.
It's the same freq variable. It's a global variable in this case.
That's right. Yes, a global. Yeah. Again, this is quite sort of this sort of code is typical of the sort of hacky introspective code that I do, where I don't mind a few globals knocking about. I mean, obviously, if you start writing a proper, you're getting a proper project going, a piece of work, then you pay more attention to passing things in through functions rather than using globals and so on. But it's kind of exploratory, is what it is.
Oh, actually, in this case, it is a local variable. The anti-alias function receives the frequency as an argument, so it's not really a global in there.
All right. Okay. Yeah. There you go. But it's kind of it's referenced elsewhere in note on rather than being returned. So, but anyway, so essentially that's what the anti-aliasing does. That's the general gist behind it. Like I say, we can tunnel into sort of mass of it. It does get quite hairy, but essentially what it is. So if so this is an interesting point. If the thing that the FFT real and the FFT permute generate is essentially the frequency bins and the phase. And if you've used any of the wavetable editors in Serum or Vital, or even I think Operator, his thing is a little bit like that as well. And it's how additive synthesizers. That is essentially, by what you're seeing is a visualization of those bins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And as you edit those bins in like Serum or Vital, and then reflect them back in the actual, and they're reflected back in the actual wave, that's kind of doing what's a similar thing to what's happening in this function.
So kind of looking ahead to when your wavetable is finished, do you have plans to implement something like that where users can draw on like kind of similar to how we can click on ReEQ to make bands, we can draw like one wave of the wavetable, like something like Serum? Do you have plans for that?
It's a maybe at the moment. I mean, so that sort of thing it exists in Serum, it exists in Vital, it exists in Dune 3. And it's okay. I'm getting a bit more experimental with it. I'm taking a slightly different approach to wave generation. I might end up with that, because if you want to actually draw a wave in by hand, then that's probably one of the best ways of doing it. But I've always felt that by going into like the wave editor, you were kind of removed from the sound creative process. And there are some other ways I'm coming up with that are a bit more hands-on and a bit more immediate in terms of the sort of waves that you're generating. So like I say, it's all rather. It's not that it's secret. It's just all quite experimental, and I'm not sure which way it's going to go at the moment. But
that's cool.
I'm trying to approach to wave generation.
I do agree with you. Like, once you're drawing, you're just kind of having fun. It's not like I ever drew a thing for my new song. You know what I mean?
Well, exactly. I mean, the problem is as well is what you're actually drawing. Generally, it's hard to think if that's got any correlation with what you actually hear, because a lot of the times of what you're hearing in sort of waves, for example, is the discontinuities, is the change amount and things like that. And what a lot of the wave editors in the commercial synthesizers are, they're almost like a paint package, and it's kind of it's like there's a gap between what you're actually drawing and seeing and what you're actually hearing. It's like it almost like uses a different part of the brain. So
absolutely,
yeah. So you got it.
And cool. I think that thinking about these things that are going to use different parts of the brain and whatnot, these considerations, I think, are the things that make the user interface great, like the one that we have in ReEQ.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's I suppose I got to where ReEQ is. Yes, it has been inspired. I've took inspiration from other commercial EQs, but I looked at as many as I could, and then I thought, I like that from that one. I like that from this one, and I actually kind of think it, more streamlined if it worked this way or did it this way, and you can kind of sort of move it on from there. I mean, the existing commercial things have done. I mean, they're standing on the shoulders of giants as well, and I think that's the best way to move it on, is to look at the best that you can in its kind of class and think, that's great. How could I improve it? What simple things could I do that would, be more streamlined or easier to do or more intuitive, that sort of thing.
All right.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. Let's hear this.
So, yeah, let's see if we can get it to make a noise.
I do have the plugin here, but I have other things going on as well. So, and as far as I can tell, I still have everything muted. Okay, I'm going to first play with this on mute, because you never know. And it's generating a sine wave. All right, let's move on to the next shape. Oh, so I can... this is a continuous controller, so I can go to somewhere in the middle, somewhere where you get.
It'll kind of jump. I think what it be at some point it'll just like jump to the the next one.
Okay, so you cannot get just part of a wave and part of another wave.
Not yet.
Okay. okay. But let me try this. So that's definitely not a sine wave anymore. And if I go up, yeah, we don't see any craziness. So I think this is safe for us to hear.
Yeah, so if we can pick the sawtooth in there, so there should be a sawtooth in there. Yeah, put the sound on. That should tell us straight away.
Beautiful.
Let's play with some other ones.
Justin, do you hear the sound going to you?
Yeah, I hear the sound.
Okay, cool. I'm sure the chat's hearing it too. If let us know in the chat if we ever have sound stuff. That sounds squarey.
Cool.
Okay, so by aliasing. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions here for you, Justin.
Yeah, sure.
One of them, like we kind of talk about ReEQ and moved past, but maybe it's something you can give us some thoughts on. Worldwide Basement Vibe says ReEQ is the best, except when I try to do parameter modulation via audio source. So I don't even know if that's like a wider kind of ReaPIR thing that happens. Mm-hmm.
So I've got a bit of a bug list, as all programs have. With and I think that's one that I'm due to look at next. Actually, there's a certain setup with there's a couple of people on the forum who have mentioned it. There's a certain setup in the modulation which doesn't work quite as expected. So I will get onto that and I will make sure it all works. So
cool.
That's going to get resolved real soon. That's probably the next thing I'll do.
Cool. And he says, yeah, it works, but it locks all FQ gain and Q after applying.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
Cool. So that's known. That's a known bug. Justin's going to be on it. And Bo asks, is Justin planning on making a compressor?
Oh, I really did think about it. I was having after I was so happy with the way that ReEQ turned out, I started getting some grand plans. I was like, oh, God, we could do a compressor, we could do a gate, and before you know it, you've got a Fabfilter like bunch of
sweet
bread butter audio sort of plugins, all done with JSFX. I wouldn't rule it out. I think I've got some more things to do with ReEQ yet, but at some point I will, probably with ReEQ, I will say, right, okay, that's kind of done now, until the next time I loop back to it. And yeah, I've thought about a compressor. I will give that some more thought, actually.
Cool. And if y'all in the chat overall, there's you support people who make JSFX more and more. You give them more financial incentive to get making more stuff. With Garant, we saw the same thing. Like, I think, give people money and they will give you cool stuff.
Yes. I mean, on that front, I just to sort of take the opportunity, actually. So I put a PayPal sort of pay me link up because I got quite a few emails from people saying, can we at least buy you a beer or something like that? This is great. And it was, I hadn't even thought about it. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll put a link, and it's a bit of a, if you want to buy me a beer, just send me. If you don't, that's great. It's just nice to hear like using it. But I'm incredibly grateful to the people that have bought me a beer. So, yeah.
That's nice. Yeah, the link is in the description of this video too. It's the 3rd birthday of ReEQ, so if you want to buy Justin a beer, you can always do that. Somebody also said Comrade Kotelnikov would feel really sad that everyone's using Nyquist frequency instead of Kotelnikov's. I guess it's not a question, but it's a funny statement.
I didn't realize there was a rivalry. Okay, so where did we get to? We got to we got to anti-alias wavetables essentially. So that's it. No aliasing, wavetables, great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the next iteration in.
Oh, there's more. Awesome.
Oh, there's more. Yeah, there's just a little bit more. Right. So in this version, it's kind of it's a little bit sort of progressed on from the last one, in that there's a bit more attention paid to smoothing, essentially how smooth it's all working. So the one prior to this, when you moved the selected the wavetable, it's kind of jumped between them. And moreover, there's the other thing that it was doing as well is it was the way that we call the anti-aliasing was that, so after every 256 samples or so, we generated a wave and then we immediately switched to that wave. Yeah. Now, in a synth engine, that's, you know, when you may be wanting to, you know, go between these waves a little bit smoother in two ways really. One, in terms of being able to select which wave that you're, you know, pointing at with the slider. And then also, you don't want necessarily inside the sample loop to suddenly jump from, say, a sine wave to a sawtooth or any other shape. So the strategy we employ there, we use double buffering. So it generally works like this. So we've got sort of two wavetable buffers, and double buffering means that we can be looking at or using one while writing the other, and then when the one that we've written to is full, we can swap them around. That's generally how double buffering sort of works. In this context, what happens is that we generate our anti-aliased wavetable, and then over the next 256 samples or so till the next one, we linearly interpolate over to it rather than just snapping to it. So over the 256 samples, we kind of merge or interpolate into the target that we want. And then at that point, we'll generate the next one, and we'll just keep that going, swapping the buffers around. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Kind of like on a very short time version of just kind of constantly kind of fading between two items, right?
Yeah.
But this is happening on like a very tiny fraction of a millisecond or a second, fraction of a millisecond.
It's tiny, yeah. but it'll make sure that it stays really smooth internally.
Yep. That's cool.
And this comes with some other benefits as well, which I'll mention shortly. But for now, so the other thing that this does, I think this is the one that does it, is that I think this is the iteration where, like I say, on the slider, instead of it snapping between the different waveforms, I think it actually blends between them as you move the slider. So maybe we could actually sort of give it a run and see if it's the one that I think it is, the iteration.
Well, there is a variable called current wave blend, so I suppose that's the version that is doing it.
Yes.
I'm going to
the blending and the double buffering.
Do a full compile reset here, just for good measure. And right now, I know that you will not hear anything. That's on purpose. I always like to see if the levels are good and if the shapes are making sense, especially when we are in this development kind of mode. Oh, and it's snapping back to 0.
Oh, hang on.
That could be a glitch. I'm going to re-add the plugin to the track. It's always good to re-add the plugins. Because you never know. all this thing of being able to recompile and rerun stuff while the plugin is executing is great, but it can also sometimes hurt you. Oh,
okay,
no.
Is it snapping back? Okay, hang on. Right, okay.
That could be, you're not in read mode, are you, with automation and stuff?
Don't worry about it. Just copy this last one, and this is the last this is the final incarnation. Pop this one.
Cool.
Okay.
Because it contains the same.
And
buffering.
I'm not sure. I don't have any kind of automation going on, and the other sliders are not doing that, so I don't know.
True. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, to tell you the truth, I don't even know how I would switch to read versus write mode for that. But here's the last version. Full compile reset, just for good measure. It's always, when your code is not working, sometimes you develop these kinds of ticks, and this is one of mine.
I meant to ask, actually, if you got I know you've got the spectrum analyzer up. If you got an oscilloscope?
Sure, here it is. Okay. Let's make it a little bit smaller. Oh, this is actually behind our faces, isn't it? How about that? And
yeah, there's good.
This can be there. And the plugin, our plugin is here as the first one in the chain. And this is what it looks like. I guess the wave length is so long that we don't actually see it a lot here, but it's starting to take shape as I go up. And then while this note is playing, I'm gonna try to change the wave form. Oh, would you look at that? And I want to get the keyboard out of the way from the spectrum analyzer. Now this is very nice, and I want to hear it, but not on such a high note. We know that aliasing is not happening, but we don't need to blast a C5 on everyone. So how about we unmute this? Okay, that's good. And let me decrease here. We can see, such a beautiful thing. What is this hard sync about?
Oh, we'll come to that in a minute. That was we'll. So I've sent you another file as well. Can you put that in the same? It's a bit more of a non-traditional complex shape.
Sure.
For some reason, just the title of the file came instead of the file itself, so you may want to redrag that.
Yes.
Okay.
But we know,
since I got you, Justin,
the file is called acid, so.
Yep.
Justin, I got a question for you, because I've seen this in other wavetables synths too, where sometimes as you're morphing between two shapes, you also get a little bit of a fluctuation of like loudness. So I mean, some of that is because like you're adding overtones, but like we were seeing on the spectrum, the fundamental itself was kind of getting a little quieter as well as we were morphing. So what makes that happen?
It will just be the different frequencies and harmonics, just how that's balanced in the actual sort of waveform and wave shape. That's all it'll be really. If you think about each kind of waveform over a cycle imparts a certain amount of sort of sonic or sort of audio energy, then different waveforms going to impart a different amount, and that's going to be because spectrum analyzer is kind of frequency over time sort of thing. Then you're going to see it. So
that's reflected. Okay. Oh, cool. This one. Oh, I know this one.
Yeah.
And it changes over time too.
Yeah, so if you just sort of select that one and play it.
All right.
Pop down sliders.
I suppose I will have to reload the plugin for that to be picked up. So
no, you shouldn't do. No, it should just do it.
Well.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah, because it reads the folder at the start, doesn't it? Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah, it didn't work for me, but whatever. Here we are. Let's hear this. Okay.
Beautiful.
Cool stuff.
Oh.
Okay.
So if we were to put some polyphony into this, we would just replicate the oscillators, and we would have, like, if you want 3 voices, we would have 3 of these oscillators, or in other words, I guess not in words, in code, we would have 3 of this wavetable play situation going. We would only have one wavetable, but the wavetable play, we would have 1 per voice. Is this right?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. You'd have to refactor it so that, you know, maybe these things are stored in the index using the memory indexing, that sort of thing. Come up with some sort of scheme like that. But yeah, you could totally refactor it. If you've got an independent one of those for each voice, then that's generally how you do it.
Okay. Yeah. So tell us about HeartSync and how this one works and everything else that you want to share about this.
Right. Okay. Right, so this is kind of the last one really, but it's the one that's got all the buffering in. So what we've got there is the double buffering, like I've said, so that we get a completely smooth fade at a you know, for every sort of cycle of the audio thing, it's fading to the destination target wavetable that it wants to be. That's all anti-aliased, and then we've incorporated some blending between the actual wavetable shapes in the wavetable file that gets loaded. So that's perfect. So that's stipulated as a 0 to 1, essentially, from 0 at the start to 1 at the end, and any kind of level of smoothness or sort of gradient in between all of the wavetables. But what happens is, by adopting this scheme, and there's something I sort of figured out, is that, well, if we're generating a wavetable every 256 samples, and that's when we change the target that we blend into, well, we've got an opportunity there to actually affect or manipulate the wave in some way via some kind of algorithmic processing. Okay. Now, I think there are some wavetables that do this kind of thing, but it always took me back a little bit. I mean, Vital hasn't got many algorithms for working for actual, you know, changing wavetables as they're being played. Serum has. If you look at Serum, it's got all the things like bend and mirror and async.
Yeah, like warping the
warping
form itself. Yeah, warping. Cool.
The only problem with Serum's warping mode, wave changing sort of modes, is that it seems to use a path in the engine that doesn't anti-alias anymore. So if you load a sawtooth up or a square wave, and then just turn on, say, you know, bend or something like that without actually turning the dial for bend, it aliases. It goes through a different part of the audio. I don't know why you know, Steve did it that way. You know, I'm not privy to the internal workings of it, but that's the way that it works. So you have to kind of suffer the aliasing if you use any of those wave changing things. But what we've got in the code here is we've got an opportunity that when we actually write the wave, get the anti-aliased version of the wave, or even just before that, we can maybe just algorithmically change the wave in some way, maybe bend it, warp it, twist it, do whatever to it, and then anti-alias that one, set that as the target, and we're good to go. So we can introduce this idea of having wave modifiers that do all sorts of different wave. And on the synth that I'm sort of making, I've got about there's 30 odd different things you can do with controls to the waves. all sorts of different things. And one of them, which I thought I'd just pretty much copy the algorithm verbatim into this, is for it to manipulate the wave in such a way so that it produces a sound which is characteristic of classical hard sync sounds on synthesizers. Mm-hmm. So the idea of hard sync on a classical synthesizer is that you've got an oscillator, and then according to the frequency of another oscillator, it resets the phaser on the first oscillator. Mm-hmm. And the upshot of that is you get this kind of like, well, it's a very characteristic sound. It's a bit like this tearing sort of, you know, people back in the day thought it was you know, an electronic oscillator trying to be an electric guitar. It was this kind of severe tonal shift, which got like a roaring sound in a way. And the way that we can simulate that with a wavetable is actually to have it under control, take the whole wave and create copies of it based on a certain size and number of copies that we want inside the wave. Yeah, and it produces the same effect. And you can see this effect if Serum's got one, Vital. So if you go and do the hard sync there, you'll see it. It's like takes a wave, and then it, as you dial the hard sync, it creates more copies internally of the wave as it, you know, and you've got this discontinuous which produces the characteristic sound. Okay, so in the actual code, if you look at where it says down at the bottom in @sample, where it's calling blend wavetables to do the little blending and creating the target wavetable. So blend wavetable is taking the two waves that we're referencing on the slider, coming up with a linear interpolation of the whole wavetables. And then we've got a thing called hard sync here.
Wow, that's a long line.
Which is just a yeah. But if you see the line that's calling hard sync, what it's taking is a value, the wavetable that we want to process, and then the wavetable that's the result of the blending that's gone off. And if we actually look at the hard sync formula, which was a bit further up, about line 116.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two functions here that are doing the hard sync, the wave copying essentially. A lot of this will become really clear when you actually see the wave in the oscillator. But what it's doing, what transfer does, it copies wavetable data of a given size and length to another wavetable of a different size or length. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at, so it kind of scales it in a way. It's like a scaling function. Okay. And what hard sync does, it uses that, it calls that in a loop based on how many full wavetables we want scaled down and pasted back into. It's like a copy and paste job at different scales. Okay. The main thing is, like I say, this will become clear when you see it in the oscilloscope. But the main thing is that this could be doing anything in the kind of setup that we've got. This could be doing anything to the wave. It could be chopping it about, inversing, mirroring parts of it, all the things that you see in Serum, all of those things. It could be saturating. It could be doing, like I say, I've got about 30 odd algorithms at the moment.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So
I had a question about that actually. So kind of when we're swooping a wavetable in Serum, I kind of like, you know, I can follow. And then when we get to like warping, even like warping a sine wave so that like the top of the cycle is faster and the bottom is like kind of more stretched out. I always wondered how it deals with like clicking. Because you are, you know, as you have the sound going and you're doing that type of warping, like, yeah, how do you not click?
Well, certainly in the code that we've written, it doesn't click because, I mean, it doesn't click because there are no, everything's smoothing, everything's kind of blending into from one thing into another. in the setup we've got here. I can't speak for Serum because I don't know how Steve sort of coded it.
Right.
But certainly in our setup, we're blending towards a target. So even if there's an abrupt change in the target, you're not going to get that harsh clicky thing going on. It's going to morph to it over 256 samples.
That's cool. Yeah, gotcha.
Okay, so any more questions on the code, or should we give it a run and you'll be able to see it in the oscilloscope?
I want to see this.
I also am sending a sound that I'm wondering if we can also try using after we did the acid and basic shapes.
Okay, so right now I am on the acid, which may not be ideal for showing this hard sync thing. So let's go to a sine wave.
Yes, a saw's a good one, actually. Sine's okay, but saw's pretty good as well.
How about that? Cool.
Nice.
I don't think you've got the sound on. I can't hear the sound.
No, I don't have the sound on. I'm always afraid. I streamed before loud sounds. I don't want to do it again. Okay, I stopped.
So just as a note on this as well, I mean, that might have sounded a little bit steppy there, but the reason that is because of the JSFX slider. If you because obviously the mouse is interacting with it, if you sometimes get a better result by making that window as wide as possible, so you've got a lot of resolution on the slider.
Yeah, I actually did that trick before. I even went as far as doing this kind of thing to get a really wide window, which is not something you can do on every operating system. But in macOS, I don't know if there is a limit to this. You can just keep going. I remember that in Windows,
another
this is not
thing you can do is write a quick line of automation so that it's like fully linear, as linear as it can be.
You could do. I mean, if you
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that. You could maybe going backwards and forwards or something on a programmatically, and then it should be perfectly smooth.
Okay, what I'm up to right now is loading the other shape that Aria sent to me.
Cool. That's always been my favorite sound to put in a wavetable synth. It's the sound of zipper on pants. And it sounds good as a synth, but you got to use it really bassy. Don't go too high with it.
Okay. First, I want to see what we are up against. Oh, I didn't drag. Come on, file. Come with me, file. No, why don't you want to come with me, file? Can you please come with me, file? Come on. Yeah, here we are. Drag and drop. There you go. This is what it looks like. Okay.
Hi, Jim Dooley. Jim says, this hurts my brain, but I'm going to keep going until my brain starts to hurt. Yep.
All right, so it is in the right location, but we learned that a full compile reset never hurts. Do you want to save the modifications? Did I change something? Yes, save it. And close this, and then that's not that. You gotta love all the windows that this dog creates for you. Awesome stuff. All right, here we are with the new sound. And I will go more bassy. That's not very loud. Okay, we can go there.
I guess watch out, because that sound has its own ramp, so it may be quiet at the beginning of the wavetable and then go nuts later down the line.
Okay. Yeah, also I had the wrong file loaded, but I have the right one now.
Ah, cool.
And now it's almost like a sine wave.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what happens. Well, if you think about it, as anything that you play moves towards Nyquist, there's no harmonics. There's no extra harmonics dropping off. So ultimately, it's going to become more and more sine-like.
Mm. And even before that, they start to become inaudible to our aged ears, you know.
Yeah, you can't really. I'm sure there was some synthesizers back in the day that actually took advantage of that, so that they did the mini blep thing for when, you know, notes were played further down in sort of frequency in the lower range. Then as you start getting towards the end, they just at some point just start playing sine waves, and you can't tell the difference because they're so close to Nyquist. There's just about no harmonics really, and you can't hear generally much after, you know, 15, 16, 17K anyway. So.
And that's a good
and even the first
anti-aliasing
harmonic
filter.
of 15K. Yeah. Oh yeah, Bose's parameter automation. Yeah, we could do that as well, but I think we got the gist. I know Leandro doesn't like automation, so I'm not gonna make him.
Yeah, it's not that I don't
some.
like it. I don't know how to use it, but I will learn. I'm in the process.
Cool.
Yeah. Actually, you could actually in ReaFIR you can. Yeah, you should be able to right-click on it and like set it to an LFO or something, shouldn't you? The slider. Can you do that?
Yeah, you can go param. So click on it, Leandro, and then go param up there. You gotta do it one by one, and then go. Wait. Oh yeah, parameter modulation MIDI link, one above where you are, and then you can take LFO. And then let's use a sine. Maybe make the speed, it's 1 hertz now. Let's make it like a 1/10 of a hertz or something, so that we can actually see it kind of evolve in the space of 10 seconds. We can play with the bass line and such but it's already looking like it's going from like the top to the end. So let's hear that. Oh, there's definitely a sweet spot in the middle there. I like the tone up.
So if you got, say at the moment you've got it modifying which wave it's playing, yeah.
And you can do the same to heart sync.
And I will.
Is that what you were going to suggest?
Yeah, you could maybe have it slightly going at a slightly different frequency on hard sync, so you get these two. But it should give you an indication of how really smooth it is as well, without, you know.
I really don't want to do the whole strength on the hard sync, I don't think, right?
Yeah, you can adjust the strength of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you already have. Cool.
Yes.
Cool. You can also disable the wave one if you want, just so that it's more of like just to demonstrate just the hard sync without the wave changing.
Okay, I can do that.
So you can, yeah.
What do I do? Do I touch this slider?
Yeah, you can give that another wiggle and go to param.
And then disable that.
And then just untick, yeah. Oh, that's a great alarm.
It sounds like a robot in a cheap sci-fi movie.
Yeah, there you go.
Can you play one sustained note? Cool. Real nice.
So, robot, what do you want for dinner?
R2D2 eat your heart out.
Yeah. Incredible. You have like kind of the workings of a GUI there as well. Is that just kind of like for your own reference as you were writing this?
Yeah. So
Okay.
as I was writing it, I was really just printing things out. I did maybe think about doing a actually this can be left up to anybody who wants to do it, but a kind of graphical display of the wavetable or the different wavetables, a bit like Serum's got or Vital, something like that. So that'd be a nice little exercise.
Cool. Yeah, that's a nice challenge.
Yeah, won't be too hard. Cool. So so there you go. That was the code that was. So it's anti-aliased wavetable that can load Serum or Vital wavetables. Does all the blending between the different waves and blending to source and destination. So it's really smooth, and with a wave algorithm in that's in this case just doing hard sync. There you go, guys.
That's actually amazing.
Awesome.
I love how everything that you described, which is a lot, can be done with these lines of code. I mean, it's not trivial to write these lines of code, but it's not that many, and it's not so daunting because you can think, okay, it's 100, 200 lines of code. I have one afternoon. I can do this.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. So you're writing like your entire synth kind of in Juice, but you're taking modules from that and testing them in ReaFIR as you write them. Is that right?
Yeah. So I'm writing it in C++ and I'm using the Juice libraries. Just because you get so much done already in terms of just the general framework and the way that it can generate AUs and VSTs and things like that. And then the way I've got it set up in Xcode is that when I go to run, Command and R on the Mac, it loads ReaFIR. It defaults to a project where I've got my plugin loaded. But it's great because I can actually set breakpoints in Xcode and debug it and look at all the variables and step through the code. Checking out, it's really, really good that way.
So Juice is a framework that can smooth out the differences between the different standards, from audio units to VSTs and even other things like a standalone app. But it also comes with modules for doing digital signal processing and for graphical user interfaces. How much of that can you use and how much you have to recreate? Like, can you use some anti-aliasing thing from Juice, or do you have to write it yourself?
No, it didn't have that in. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't got any oscillator anti-aliasing, not even in bleps or anything like that.
Okay.
It has got. I mean, there's an awful lot of stuff in Juice. It's quite a big sort of library. It does a lot of things. In terms of like generate, processing audio buffers, linking effects together. It's got things like a built-in reverb and things like that just to get going off the bat. So it's pretty good in that way. And in terms of the graphics as well, it's got a really rich set of graphic drawing things, and it's got really good graphic components as well. So it's got knobs, sliders, menus, all sorts of those things built in, and you can actually change the look and feel of them. So it's pretty good. There's the thing I would say in JSFX is that you have to kind of build all that up yourself. And I know that Grant, who you had on, the other week, he's got a really good UI library. So that's probably, if you could do a sort of general plugin. I mean, I didn't use any other libraries. I just kind of hacked it in myself, as it were. But that's probably a good start to use Grant's library, something like that.
Leandro's making one of his own now as well.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm making a library
it's
now. I can pitch the idea behind it is that I'm not necessarily going to give you many components like knobs and that sort of thing, but I am going to give you a design system. So I'm going to give you a set of colors that work well in user interfaces and spacing that works well. And of course, I'm borrowing all the design system from elsewhere, specifically a CSS framework called Tailwind. And I am taking the opportunity to also recreate some of the DSP stuff to understand how it really works. Like implementing a discrete Fourier transform with our bare hands is a lot of fun. And I'm also giving you data structures to help you use the memory in a way that makes sense. Like I'm giving you the ley lines, and I'm giving you the Rbj filters, and I'm giving you structs like C structs and arrays that know their sizes, and maybe in the future arrays that you can resize if necessary, but you would have to allocate pessimistically all the space that you would need. Of course, you don't want to be allocating in the audio thread, but you get the idea. I'm giving you some of the structure you would get from these other frameworks in JSFX, because I think that JSFX is so easy to use, so welcoming to people like myself that don't know much about audio programming, and I want to see better looking and easier to develop JSFX out there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very noble cause. Very cool.
So I do have to leave in a few minutes. So I guess if anybody in the chat has any last questions for Justin, throw them on. Justin, thank you for being with us, for spending so much time with us, walking us through this stuff. I really learned a lot more than I thought I would, which is really good. And that's not a comment on your explaining abilities, it's a comment on my understanding abilities, because it's still really new to me. I think lots of people in the chat really enjoyed it. Lots of compliments coming your way for ReEQ and all of that. If you're welcome here anytime. We do this every Monday, so if you ever want to come and talk to us, we'd love to have you. And whenever you need like beta testers, let us know. We'll
that's a good question to ask, actually. People who are interested in helping out, either ReEQ or this new plugin that you're developing, either with code or helping out with testing, or how can people reach out and help you?
Yeah, I mean, people have generally reached out. The people that have reached out have just got in touch with me over at the forum, but I've got no problem with. I think the forum's probably the best bet, because rather than give my email out publicly and it'll just immediately get spammed to death by some sort of search bot or something. But if you just get me on the the ReEQ forum, the JSFX forum, send me a private message, and then we'll just take the exchange from there. I don't mind giving my email on there. That's fine.
Cool. I put your name in the chat. It's nitsuj on ReEQ forums. You can get in there, help out.
Yeah, that's cool. And I think I said that you guys want me to. Well, I mean, you've got it in the code share now, but I can send over the various iterations of it if that's of any use.
Yeah, I would love to actually give
yeah.
this a bit more time and play around and change things about the code, and even do the challenge you proposed, because one of the components I have in my new library is something that plots a wave. You just give it a bunch of samples, it's going to plot the wave. So I want to plug it in and see what it looks like.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that would be great.
Awesome. All right, shall we wrap this up, everybody?
Yes.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone for watching. We usually get a few people. Today we got a lot more people, so thanks for being with us. Thanks for your questions and comments. Do all the stuff that YouTube likes you to do. Happy birthday to ReEQ and ReSpectrum. Big props to Justin for making them.
Yeah, thanks, yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Adios, everybody.
Okay.